That will be set up immediately when royal assent is given next month or very soon after.
Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation Sarah Jones says Labour will stand by the government's compensation scheme.
As Starmer set out yesterday, is really clear that we'll support the government on the package of compensation that they introduce. We know the Treasury has already been working on what can be put in place. We know that there has been some interim compensation paid, although not enough, and we pushed the government on this at the back end of last year because the chair of the inquiry had suggested that some interim payments should be made that haven't been. So we will stand, shoulder to shoulder with the government.
In other news, Iran has confirmed the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and his foreign minister were killed in a helicopter crash. Footage shows the crash site on a mountainside. Harsh weather conditions hampered efforts by search teams, but the wreckage was eventually located in East Azerbaijan province. Iran's supreme leader has declared 5 days of national mourning. An election for a new president is due to take place in the next 50 days. Julian Assange is due to find out whether he can appeal his extradition to the United States. Dozens of supporters have gathered outside the Royal Courts of Justice, where Assange is facing the next stage of his legal battle. The WikiLeaks founder faces prosecution in the US over an alleged conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defence information after the publication of hundreds of thousands of leaked documents relating to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Mr. Assange's wife says she'll stop at nothing for what she's calling justice.
We hope that the courts do the right thing today and find in Julian's favour. But if they don't, we will take an emergency injunction. We will seek an emergency injunction from the European Court of Human Rights.
Ofcom has found GBNews broke broadcasting rules in a programme featuring the Prime Minister. The regulator says the People's Forum, which aired in February, failed to preserve due impartiality and it's now considering a sanction. In a statement, GBNews described the development as alarming and an attempt to silence the channel. It says the format placed the public, not journalists, in charge of questioning Rishi Sunak, and he was challenged and criticised on a number of issues. It maintains the programme was in line with the broadcasting code. And a new coin marking 80 years since the D-Day landings has been unveiled by the Royal Mint. To mark the release, 2 sand artists recreated the design on Gold Beach, where troops landed in 1944. With a diameter of 35 metres, the sand art took 5.5 hours to create. The design of the tails or reverse side of the 50p coin was revealed ahead of the anniversary on the 6th of June. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Tom and Emily.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 8 minutes past 12. Now, after a 40-year fight for justice, in the next half hour, a report into the biggest treatment disaster in NHS history will finally be published.
Yes, the infected blood scandal saw thousands of patients infected with deadly viruses, such as hepatitis C and HIV, when they were receiving blood transfusions.
Well, GB News political correspondent Catherine Forster has been following this story and has more for us.
Some of my friends have said to me, "Are you sure? Are you sure this is the NHS? Are you sure this is
the infected blood scandal is a story so shocking it almost beggars belief. In the 1970s and 80s, the NHS gave contaminated blood to over 30,000 people, to haemophiliacs whose blood doesn't clot properly, and to people needing blood transfusions. Infected with HIV or hepatitis C, over 3,000 have died. Sue Wathen was infected with hepatitis C through a blood transfusion.
I had so many years of being unwell, well, very ill actually, but just didn't know what was the matter with me.
She only found out decades later.
And I literally fell back into the chair I'd been sitting in, thinking this can't be right.
The blood product factor 8 was largely imported from the States, with blood often coming from prisoners and drug addicts. Warnings it was not safe were ignored for years.
There are still 2 people dying every week that were infected as a result of this scandal.
Author and Sunday Times political editor Caroline Wheeler has been campaigning for victims for decades.
I've spoken to many people who said that they've lost count of the number of funerals that they've attended because of this, but also the financial effect that this has had, people not being able to work for many, many years of their working lives. Some of them have made choices where they haven't had families, they haven't got married.
Colin Smith was given infected blood during a routine ear operation aged 2, despite an edict that it was not to be given to children. He died from AIDS at 7. And at a boarding school for medically vulnerable youngsters, 122 boys were infected. Victims say they were used as guinea pigs with no proper consent. The 30 still alive are fighting for redress. Victims have appealed to politicians for many years. Finally, the then Prime Minister Theresa May announced a full public inquiry in 2017. The final report is published this lunchtime.
This was covered up for many years, and the governments of all complexions have said there was nothing to see here, nothing that could have been done differently.
Labour MP Diana Johnson, who's been campaigning for victims for years, is optimistic.
And now we will get the answers, hopefully, to what actually happened and who took the decisions which allowed that dirty blood to enter our NHS. And what we know is that this was probably the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS.
And on compensation, Caroline Wheeler believes this government is set to act.
My understanding is that there will be a compensation package announced, that it will be northwards of 10 billion. That is a significant amount of money.
It can't come soon enough.
We have a WhatsApp group of a few of us, and we call ourselves Blood Friends. 2 of those people are terminally ill. This is what's happening to people. They are dying.
Catherine Forster, GB News.
Just an astonishing story.
Really astonishing. Shall we speak to our GB News political correspondent, Catherine Forster? She can join us now. Catherine, thank you very much indeed. You've spoken to victims' families about this scandal. What means the most to them when it comes to this inquiry, this report being published?
Yes, good afternoon, Tom and Emily. Well, there's 3 things that victims and victims' families are looking for. Of course, 3,000 people have already died and will never see any measure of justice, and 2 people still dying every week. First of all, they are looking for answers, and the report that's being published by Sir Brian Langstaff as a result of this public inquiry out at 12:30 will give some long-awaited answers. I hear it's about 2,000 pages. People have been piling into Central Hall behind me to read it. So answers. Who knew? Who took the decisions? Who covered it up? Who is to blame? How did this actually happen? That's the first thing. Then undoubtedly they want an apology, a proper, full apology. This is something that's been going on for decades. Successive governments have pushed it down the road because it's too hard and too expensive. We expect that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, will issue a full apology in the House of Commons this afternoon on behalf of this government and successive governments that did not act. And the final thing really is compensation. Of course, no amount of money is going to make up at all to what these people have gone through and the lives that have been stolen. But we are expecting an announcement on compensation tomorrow, upwards of £10 billion, a really significant amount of money for people, not just those infected, those that have HIV or hepatitis C, or their bereaved partners, but also the affected, so the parents of children that have died, or the vice versa, you know, people whose lives have been torn apart by this. So we don't expect the details about the money to come until tomorrow. There'll be then several weeks of consultation, but it does seem that finally, This is a story that began in the early 1970s, and this is a day that, you know, many people thought they would never see. Finally, some answers, an apology, some compensation, and some small measure of justice.
Just the most astonishing story, especially when you hear the individual stories. And it sounds like £10 billion is the most astonishing amount of money, but it really is for the most astonishing story. After all, there were people who didn't just lose their children, but they lost their jobs. The stigma around particularly HIV/AIDS. If a child had contracted it, there were cases of parents then losing their jobs, having to move home, having a real stigma placed upon the whole family in society.
Yes, exactly. And just to give you one example, little Colin Smith, who I mentioned in that package, he was haemophiliac. He got a blood transfusion when he was 2 for an ear operation. He contracted AIDS through that, and he died when he was 7. At the point at which he died, he weighed only as much as a 4-month-old baby, and his parents, his family, were vilified because such was the stigma of AIDS at that time. And of course, his parents, you can never make it up to them. You can never give them back their little boy, but just absolutely horrendous. And other people that haven't died. Some people lost multiple members of their family. Other people have made the decision not to have children, unable to work because long-term health implications. It really is quite something. So a really huge day today for those people.
And £10 billion, or at least £10 billion, we're expecting in compensation to victims and their families. Where is that money going to come from? Will it come from the NHS budget? I know Jeremy Hunt is very much behind giving compensation. He has a constituent that he's been campaigning for and been speaking to about this. But where is this money going to come from?
Well, my understanding, and we'll find out more tomorrow, is that it's going to be counted basically as a lump sum. It's going to be capital spending funded by borrowing, so it will not be coming out of existing NHS budget. So you mentioned Jeremy Hunt. Worth saying, I think he was, of course, Health Secretary. As you mentioned, one of his affected constituents came to him, and it was he that pushed for this full public inquiry as Health Secretary under Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time. It was ordered several years ago. It took much longer than expected because of the volume of evidence they've had to consider. And of course, Jeremy Hunt is now the Chancellor, so rather fitting that it's up to him ultimately. And he obviously feels, as does the Prime Minister, that this is the right thing to do, no matter the cost.
And it is an extraordinary cost. £10 billion is funded through borrowing. It's 5 times the amount that the Treasury estimated abolishing the 45p rate of income tax would have been. Pretty astonishing. That was at that time decreed to be a market-moving measure. But let's hope that this doesn't rock the finances too much. Catherine Forster, thank you very much for joining us live outside the inquiry. We'll be back with you as soon as we know more details.
Yes, 12:30. We are expecting this long-awaited report to drop, to be published. So we'll come back to Catherine once that is there. But we're also going to talk about Iran's president, because he has been dramatically killed in a helicopter crash. We'll bring you the very latest with our Home and Security editor. Stay with us. This is Good Afternoon Britain. We're on GB News.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
More than 21,000 asylum seekers have gone missing in Britain over the past 5 years. The real number, by the way, will be much, much higher. The fact is, they've legged it. They're on the run and they're out committing goodness only knows what kind of crimes. But that's not the official line. Do you want to know what the official line is?
So do we now know what's happened to the remainders who have no legal basis on which to still be in the United Kingdom?
The Home Office, through our different mechanisms of tracing people, are continuing to seek to trace them.
So when people do disengage, and I think that's a more accurate word than gone missing, when people do disengage from us, we respond to that.
They've not disengaged, Mr. Cleverly. The vast majority of them had their claims rejected and then ran off because we're not deporting them quickly and they're not going to just sit there and wait for you to come and get them in a few years' time. If they don't turn up for an interview twice, they change their phone number, they don't fill in a questionnaire twice, they move address, or they change their lawyer without informing the Home Office. That's it. Is it any wonder, though, when you've got these civil service chuckle brothers running the show behind the scenes?
Put foreign offenders aside and Albanians aside, just forget about those numbers. How many people travelling on small boats that's been refused asylum have been sent to a third country or back to their own country over the past 3 years?
I don't think we have. I
think we'll write to the committee with those numbers, Mr. Anderson.
That's staggering. That's actually
so
okay, then let's do it for the last year.
I don't have a number for non-Albanian, non-FNOs.
Perhaps they might be able to help you.
Let's do last week then.
Do we have any figures about anything?
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News with Dubes & Co from 6, followed by Farage at 7. At 8, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg addresses the state of the nation. And at 9, join Patrick Christie's Tonight, followed by Headliners at 11. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 12:22. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now, Ebrahim Raisi, Iran's president, and his foreign minister have been killed in a dramatic helicopter crash.
Yes, harsh weather conditions made it difficult for search teams to find the wreckage. Efforts by search teams, but it was eventually located in East Azerbaijan province, that province in Iran.
Yes, there has been no evidence of foul play. Iran's supreme leader has declared 5 days of national mourning. Now, an election for a new president is due to take place in the next 50 days.
Although we have to put heavy quote marks around that word. Election, of course, it's only after an approved list of candidates. Shall we get the details now with GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White, who joins us now. And Mark, this is a significant moment, not just for Iran, but for the wider region too.
Yes, indeed. There was a great deal of concern when the news started emerging yesterday with clearly concerns that perhaps there had been foul play involved here. But thankfully, so far at least, we've heard nothing coming from the Iranian government to suggest that they're pointing the finger of blame at anyone else. And of course, by that, we really mean Israel. So they seem to be off the mind that whatever happened, it was either mechanical failure or an issue with flying in a mountainous region in heavy fog. The images you're seeing now are up-close images that the media have been able to get, surprisingly perhaps, given how strictly controlled the media is in Iran, but they've been taken right up to the crash scene in the mountains in the Azerbaijani eastern province of northern Iran to see the wreckage there. And there are one or two parts that are still recognisable. The tail fin of the helicopter that reporter was standing next to, but the rest is really just mangled wreckage and blackened remains.
Mark, Iran is often referred to as one of the principal actors in what's known as an axis of evil between China and Russia and often North Korea as well. This destabilising moment could have wider implications, after all, in the accession of the next Ayatollah, who is, I think, 85 years old. What do we know about Iran's internal plans now?
Well, Iran, of course, as you say, tightly controls who is the president of that country. They've had subsequent elections where they've been able to gain an even tighter grip on hardliners within the political establishment in Iran. That is what Raisi was, a hardliner. He was being tipped as a potential replacement for the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's 85 and reportedly in ill health. Whoever, though, succeeds him will still fall into that category of hardliner without a doubt. They will be chosen to fit in with what the other hardliners in the regime want from a leader, from a president of that country. But there is always the potential for instability with the figurehead, well, the supreme leader being the ultimate figurehead, but the president being a very significant figure in that country as well. We have seen in the past significant protests and violence that's erupted when hardliners have cracked down on any form of dissent. But Iran is going through an economic crisis at the moment with inflation at 40%, and that, of course, does fuel potential for unrest as well. So we await to see what will happen. The funeral for ex-President Raisi will be tomorrow in accordance with Islamic tradition. And as you mentioned there, the election for the chosen successor will be within the next 50 days.
And Mark, is it fair to say that this is a paranoid regime? As you mentioned there, economic struggles, also a lot of discontent among the public. There will be Iranians who are celebrating this news.
Well, absolutely. There will be many Iranians, both in country and certainly that Iranian diaspora that's been forced to leave Iran over recent decades, who will be celebrating the death of this hardliner. And of course, many Western countries as well. Few tears will be shed for the passing of this man. They are a paranoid regime. Of course, they are, as all despotic regimes are in that sense. So we await really to see how that election goes and what the public reaction will be. We know, according to reports, that there are significant security personnel in numbers now out on the streets of Iran's main urban areas to ensure that there is no unrest, I should say, in the coming days.
Tell us a little bit about how we can be sure, or at least confident, that there was not foul play at hand here. There's been much speculation about the quality of aircraft in Iran, particularly thanks to Western sanctions.
Yeah, well, this helicopter itself was an old Bell 212, an American helicopter that, you know, was 4 decades or so old, and they struggled to get the parts to be able to ensure that these aircraft remain properly airworthy. So that will be, I'm sure, a key factor in investigating what has gone on here. Also, of course, the decision to fly the president in what was less than ideal weather conditions in a mountainous region. And I guess the concern has always got to be, if the finger of blame starts to point towards officials within the government, then does it actually conveniently point elsewhere and suggest that foul play might have been at play here? If that is the case, if it does develop into that, then clearly that is much more worrisome in the weeks ahead. But for the moment, at least, the mood music coming out of Tehran seems to not be indicating that they have any suspicions about what caused the crash.
Really, really interesting stuff there, Mark. I suppose one of the big question marks around all of this is what happens with the conflict in the Middle East, because it's not just Israel that is fighting Hamas, it's Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, funded by Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, funded by Iran, that are actually posing a great threat as well. Will this have any reverberations on these proxy actors that, frankly, have been hitting British interests as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually, and there is always the potential that they want to lash out in response to what's happened, whether the government in Tehran sees the hand of another involved in that helicopter crash or not. Proxies may see it differently. They may want to lash out just through anger at what has happened to President Raisi. We know that this morning already there have been some missiles that have been launched by Hezbollah into northern Israel. It's often a daily routine up in northern Israel, it has to be said as well. There are not many rockets, if any, these days launched from Gaza because of the operation to take out and dismantle Hamas in Gaza. But still, on occasions, you get these attacks from proxy groups in Syria and Iraq.
We've just had the news in from the infected blood inquiry.
We have indeed, and a subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up. As we speak, we're receiving the first few details of this report into what's been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS.
Between 1970 and 1991, the infected blood scandal saw tens and thousands of people who underwent blood transfusions left with lifelong health complications such as hepatitis C and HIV.
Well, GB News political correspondent Catherine Forster joins us now. Catherine, this report has now been published. What does it say? What does it tell us?
Yes, some 2,500 pages in this report. And already, really, from the little we've seen of it, it could not be any more damning. So Brian Langstaff, who's chaired the inquiry, talks of a subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up and the deliberate destruction of relevant documents. It goes on to say that they believe that someone, a civil servant, took an active decision to destroy documents in the early 1990s to basically cover the tracks of what has gone on here. And in the case of what happened at Trelaw School, that boarding school for haemophiliac boys, absolutely shocking. He says that children were used as objects for research, that the risks of contracting HIV and hepatitis were ignored. He said that the staff favoured the advancement of research over the best interests of the children, which he said was unethical and wrong. He said there was no doubt that staff were aware of the risks. We knew that it would be explosive. It's been many years in the making, but my goodness, these early indications, just from what we've seen so far, absolutely damning on many levels. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, somebody who's campaigned on this for a long time, he's previously described this as a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale.
It really does seem that way, Catherine. Just to go over those first few details, this cover-up, but particularly the destruction of documents by a civil servant or by civil servants in the early 90s. I suppose these facts have been eked out over the course of this inquiry. How long has this inquiry been going on for?
Well, it was ordered by Theresa May when she was Prime Minister back in 2017 at the behest of the then Health Secretary, now Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who'd had an affected constituent. So it's been going on for 5 or 6 years. It was due to report last year. It's gone on for a year longer because of simply the huge amount of evidence. So the people inside that have gone in to see it a few hours early, they're not giving out paper copies. And when you listen to the length, 2,527 pages. It's really easy to understand why. But Sir Brian Langstaff did issue an interim findings about a year ago and said there was no reason to delay beginning compensation then. Now that hasn't happened, but it does sound like things are finally going to move, and we expect an announcement on upwards of £10 billion of compensation to be made by the government tomorrow.
And Catherine, the inquiry says much of the responsibility for failures identified in the report lie with successive governments failing to act in order to save face and expense. How does Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, who are expecting to stand up and apologise, how does he even begin to apologise for something that has gone on for so many years and so many governments had failed to get a handle of?
Well, there's nothing, is there really, that anybody can say or do that will in any way compensate these people for what they've been through, and the 3,000 people who haven't seen any measure of justice because they've already died. But Rishi Sunak standing up and offering what I expect to be a profuse and profound apology on behalf of successive governments, I think that will mean something to these families. They've wanted an apology, they've wanted answers. The answers are now coming. Okay, it's taken decades too long. This tragedy should have stopped really as soon as it began in the early 1970s or by the 80s, and it hasn't. But you know, I think it will go some way. They're never going to see ultimate justice, are they? And of course, there's many people that potentially, you know, will never be held to account. Many of the people involved in the 70s and 80s will have passed away, and we don't know whether any criminal prosecutions will be brought. I think that could happen. It certainly happened elsewhere. But, you know, at least this is something. And the money too, there will be very significant amount of money going to some of these families. Again, you can't make up for what's happened, but it will be something.
Catherine, this was first reported about in the press back in 1983. That was when the first article in the Mail on Sunday established that there was likely this scandal going on. And yet it wasn't until 2017 that an inquiry was set up. Indeed, this blood continued to be given to people throughout the early 1990s as well, or at least to the late 1980s. This is the most extraordinary litany of failure after failure.
Yeah, quite incredible, isn't it? The warnings were clearly there from the mid-1980s. I believe there was a television documentary as well. People like the then Health Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, came in for quite a lot of criticism during the inquiry. I think he feels he's been unfairly targeted. Of course, many ministers, governments, NHS officials have perhaps not asked as many questions as they should, or looked the other way. But at the time, he said, oh, there is no conclusive evidence, there is no conclusive proof that these infections were being transmitted by blood. But there were certainly a lot of red flags, But, you know, this Factor 8 blood product was being brought in from America. America got blood often from people down on their luck in prisons, drug addicts, because they were being paid for it. It wasn't heat treated that would have killed the viruses. And, you know, the warnings were there, and yet they were not heeded, and people went on to be infected. In the case of Colin Smith that I was talking about a little bit earlier, who died of AIDS at 7, and by the time he was given that Factor 8 product when he was age 2, there was an edict that it was not to be given to children, and yet he was given it anyway.
Yes, I mean, this report highlights a multitude of failures, but one of the most shocking things that I've read is that failure to be truthful with patients. So cases where doctors knew a patient had caught HIV or another disease through this blood, this contaminated blood, but they didn't let them know for months, even years. I don't know what that must have been like to find out.
Yes, unimaginable, isn't it? And some people went decades without knowing that they had been infected, people that had had blood transfusions, that had contracted perhaps hepatitis C, that were very unwell, that didn't know what it was that was causing the problem. Anita Roddick, of course, the founder of The Body Shop, she died. She was given a blood transfusion after the birth of her daughter. She didn't find out till decades later. And in the case of the boarding school, where 122 boys were infected and only 30 of them are still alive, You know, we now know from this inquiry what they suspected and have said for many years, that they were knowingly being experimented on. They weren't told of the risks, their parents were not told of the risks, and then, you know, subsequently they're taken into a room and they're said, you've been infected, you've been infected, you've been infected, you haven't. It is absolutely unimaginable. And I have to say, when I first heard of this story, Caroline Wheeler, who is the political editor of the Sunday Times, worked on this for decades. She first told me about this a few years ago. I could hardly believe it because it just seems so outrageous that you think it can't be true, and yet it is. And it's a story that's really gone under the radar for decades, but now the truth is emerging, and it really couldn't be more shocking.
It really does emphasise that weight of this story and the weight upon people who have been waiting so long for this to finally conclude. Of course, Catherine, there was an interim report in this inquiry that was published, and there were many, many calls at the time of the interim report for compensation to be paid at that stage. The government kept on saying it wanted to wait until this moment, this day, the final conclusion, to pay the money. But of course, as you said earlier, 2 people are dying every week. Every week counts.
Yes, that's right, and so many have died without ever seeing any form of justice at all. And yes, sure, the government has dragged its heels a bit because there was an interim report a year ago. They basically said, get on with it, there's no reason not to start paying compensation. Some people, people who were infected or their partners, if they've passed away, have received interim payments of about £100,000. But if you are a child who lost a parent, if you're a parent who lost a child, or if you are still alive, you know, there's been nothing. So there's a 5-week consultation after the compensation is announced. Let's hope people will start to get money soon, because many people still living with this illnesses, you know, haven't been able to work. They haven't been able to get married.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all that detail. We're going to head over to a press conference that campaigners are holding. Let's go live.
In the UK, and I just feel validated and vindicated by Sir Brian and his report today.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I think I would like to echo those thoughts. I think everybody today has read of the disasters that unfolded, and Sir Brian has been very thorough and has not minced his words.
Sir Brian has told the truth today, and that's what's important, is that we carry on telling that truth, and so that this cover-up doesn't get covered up again. It's a really, really important day for that.
I would say Jason as well.
For me, the key findings are that commercial factor products never should have been licensed for use. I think that was an incredibly strong finding of the report, and Sir Brian did what we hoped he would do, that he took the knowledge of this back to the 40s and 50s. This story did not begin in the 70s, and I think it's a credit to everybody that has campaigned on this over 3 or 4 decades.
Hello, everyone. It's Tom Clark from Sky News. Can I get your reaction to the report's conclusion that there is evidence of a cover-up by the Department of Health and others over the years since the initial wrongs happened right back in the 1970s and 80s?
I think I would say that my reaction to the fact that there has been a cover-up is that to our community, that's no surprise. We've known that for decades, and now the country knows, and now the world knows as well. And the fact that Sir Brian has exposed that not only was there a cover-up, but there was a deliberate attempt to lie and to conceal, and not just by one person either, that this was systemic. This was by government, by civil servants and by healthcare professionals. I think that really rocks what we think of as society and really challenges the trust that we put in people to look after us, to do their best and protect us. None of that can we take for granted anymore.
And I'd just like to add that I think that that the deliberate destruction of records echoes that.
It's also how we were treated as well. Sir Brian brings to the fore about how the trusts and schemes that were set up to support us have treated us as well. So this is not only a cover-up, it's actually an abuse by many people who were set to supposedly care for us.
Throughout the report, Sir Brian refers to that line, the best treatment possible was given to people. And we now know once and for all that that was a lie. People have been saying that was a lie for many, many years. And now we have the definitive word on that.
We've been gaslit for generations. This report today brings an end to that, and it looks to the future as well, and says that this cannot continue, this ethos of denial and cover-up, and that the duty of care for candour has to be reviewed going forward, so this can never happen again.
And people have lost decades of their life campaigning, and that has added to the trauma. Not only are you dealing with infection, dying, loss of family, loss of years and years of that have been wasted on this campaigning. It should never have happened. It should have been dealt with straight away.
And as I sit here as one of 27,000 blood transfusion victims, that's what echoes in my head. Behind every one of those 27,000 is a family.
Hi, Joe Pinkstone from the Daily Telegraph. I just wanted to ask you what you would say to the politicians in charge throughout the scandal and in charge now. There's some criticism of quite specific individuals in the report. I'd just like to get your thoughts on what you would say to them.
I think many of the politicians should hang their heads in shame. I think for the first time we've seen people like Jeremy Hunt and other health secretaries speak up recently and actually start to acknowledge their part in this scandal, because no single person is responsible for this scandal. It's been the result of generations of denial, delay and cover-up. And whilst there might be an apology later today from the Prime Minister, it's not just the Prime Minister who holds responsibility and accountability for this. There are many others out there, and I would expect over the coming days and weeks for many more people to come forward and say sorry. I'm sorry for my part, and if they're genuinely sorry, they will help implement the recommendations that Sir Brian has recommended today.
And I think they need to know as well what they've been sorry for. Any apologies that we've had in the past have been meaningless, because all that they've said is that this should never have happened. We know that this should never have happened. What was your part in it? What are you sorry for? That's what the community needs to hear before we can even begin to get closure on this.
And not mess us around any longer.
I think the apology on behalf of the state will be welcome, and I think something else the community would like to see is a proper apology from all of the pharmaceutical companies that manufactured Factor 8 and 9 products as well, which includes Bayer, Baxter, Revlon Healthcare, Alpha, Abbott and their successors or subsidiaries.
Victoria MacDonald from Channel 4 News. It was made very clear that this inquiry could not recommend corporate manslaughter charges, could not go there. But do any of you think, or do you know if any complaints have been made officially to the police?
I'm not aware of any at the moment. I should say that, as well as being the chair of the Society, I'm a criminal barrister, and one of the aspects that sadly the delay has caused is the fact that there are doctors out there who should have been prosecuted for manslaughter, gross negligence manslaughter. Doctors who were testing their patients for HIV without consent, not telling them about their infections, who then went on to sadly infect their partners, and they then went on to die. Those people should have been in the dock for gross negligence manslaughter, and sadly, because of the delay, that's one of the consequences, that so many people will not see justice as a result.
I'd like to add that that extends to the politicians and the licence makers that licensed Factor 8 when there were clear warnings in place. This has gone on for so long now that the people that were around at the time will be very hard to track down if they're even still alive. And that's one of the testimonies of the cover-up and the delays in getting justice to this scandal, is the time that it's taken has meant that justice delayed really is, in this case, justice denied.
I think a lot of the villains in this story sadly have now died. In particular, on a clinical level, I would include Professor Arthur Bloom and Dr. Charles Ritzer, who were the two leading haemophilia care figures at the time, and for whom, if they were still alive today, I think there could well be a case for criminal charges, and that's just a testament to the fact that the government did not launch a public inquiry earlier at the time. It should have happened probably in the 90s.
I mean, in the report today, it says that there was enough public interest in this scandal for the inquiry to have been launched around 1986. Just think about the delay for a moment and think how many people could have been brought to justice at that point but haven't.
I think we need to be aware too of the deliberate destruction of records. The records, not just patient records, but records kept by the Department of Health, and that has become clear in the report that they were deliberately destroyed.
And also the evidence that was coming forward and being placed in front of government by campaigners that was dismissed. I think today is about the vindication of many of those campaigners, who some have sadly died, and I think that's what needs to be remembered, that this has been 40 years of cover-up and campaigning.
Can I add that there's an unprecedented aspect to this inquiry, because Sir Brian Langstaff has said that this is not his final word. He is not sending his final report to the government today. The recommendations that he's recommended, he said that the government will have to provide a report to Parliament within 12 months about those recommendations, saying whether or not they are going to implement them or explaining why they are not going to implement them, and he will expect them to account for that, which I think is unprecedented, because what the chair of the public inquiry is saying to government is, I don't trust you. And that's what the community have been saying for decades. I believe there should be a presumption in the Inquiries Act that recommendations from inquiries should be implemented unless government can provide good reasons why not. Why is it that we continue to have these burning injustices? Why is it in the United Kingdom we continue to have these scandals? It's because we ignore the recommendations of public inquiries, and that must stop today.
Hi, sorry, Joe Pinkstone from the Daily Telegraph again. I just wondered, my understanding is that there's some court cases that have been paused while the inquiry makes its final report. I wonder if you feel the final report is enough of a sense of justice, or if you'll be perhaps resuming legal action against the state.
In regards to the group litigation in my name against the Department of Health, that will very much, I think, depend on what the government does now, particularly in terms, it's a civil case, depending on how they come forth tomorrow with their proposals on compensation and what that looks like. I think that will go a long way in helping to decide what we do with that case next, and if we lift the stay. There are other litigations, such as the Trelaw litigation and other litigations going on as well, but I wouldn't be able to comment on those.
Hi, Emeline Van for Radio France International. What's the general feeling at the reading of this report? Is it relief, renewed anger, vindication?
I think for me, there's been a whirlwind of emotions today. I'm sure everybody on this table would agree with that. When you've been building up to a single day for 40 years, there's no wrong or right emotion about it. But for campaigners who have been doing this for so long, for saying the things that are now in this report for so long, I think relief, absolute relief, will be an overriding emotion, and that's certainly the case for me.
I think many feel that like this is the beginning of the end, because having had an excellent public inquiry, and we should commend the chair and his team for the inquiry, the ball is now in the government's court, and it will depend on the government response. And until we have a full government response in terms of compensation, all the other recommendations, it's only then we will be able to judge whether or not this inquiry has been successful or not.
Hi, my name is Emilio. I work for Politico. I have a question, which is, obviously we've seen sort of some similarities with this recent post office scandal as well, where it seems like the politicians didn't really take it seriously enough, or potentially worse. Corporate wrongdoing potentially was brushed under the carpet. It's taken a really long time for people to notice that and to get to close to an end to that situation. Do you think, thinking about that and this situation, do we have a kind of wider problem with our society or our politics in terms of listening to people who have been wronged and getting things sorted quickly and trusting them, essentially?
That goes back to what I said earlier about the truth. This is the day of the truth, and it's up to society, up to you, the media, to ensure that that truth gets told and to keep coming back to it. Otherwise, we will be back in this situation, and millions of pounds of money that's been put into this inquiry would have been wasted.
Sorry.
After you.
I was just going to say, I think that that if we look back at this, it was cost that was a huge factor in why they bought in the American products, in why they didn't screen the blood for transfusion, and now cost is a factor yet again, because it's going to cost much, much more, and has cost much, much more, and that's just in monetary terms, and I'm not thinking then of even the loss of life, which is the most unbearable cost.
Not only is the loss of life, that those people who are still infected need ongoing health and social care needs, and that needs to be addressed within any compensation package, and that needs to be talked about.
I think today sees the victory of truth over power, and you talk about the post office scandal and this scandal. Healthcare and the law are the twin pillars of our civil society, and they've both been rocked to their foundations by both of these scandals. Had this inquiry happened decades ago when it should have happened, might the post office scandal or large parts of it have been avoided? Possibly. And that's the real tragedy of this, that we continue not to learn from failures.
I mean, we've mentioned two scandals, this one and the post office. There are many others that coalesce around the Hillsborough Law Now campaign, which Andy Burnham started, such as the nuclear test veterans, Grenfell Tower fire, the story of Zane, who died as a result of toxic matter in a family household. There are so many of these campaigns, and they all need to be looked at.
I think the civil service has closed ranks around a lie for a long time in this inquiry, and I think the similar thing has happened in the post office and many of the other inquiries that Jason has just mentioned. And ministers, sadly, weren't given the truth, and I think that decision was made a long time ago, and money is at the source of it. It seems to be always at the source of it. And we know there were conversations in higher levels of government saying that if you compensate the haemophiliacs, then that sets a precedent. So let's not do it. And when you continue that line, that government line, and closing your ranks around denial, then that's the sort of this is the result of it, and the post office is the result of it. And we need systemic change and a duty of candour at all levels of government, including the civil service, to make ministers absolutely aware of what the options are. And then maybe we'd have a chance of not having this repeated.
Thanks. It's Ryan at the Mail. Some of the strongest words in the report today were for Lord Clark, who Sir Brian described as combative and his evidence as argumentative. He said that will have aggravated the distress and upset of many. I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on what Sir Brian said.
I spent 3 days watching Lord Clark giving evidence, and he was patronising in the extreme. He had clearly never met anybody with haemophilia, and considering this is the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, for the Health Secretary not to sit down with that community and actually meet them and learn about what's happened to them is absolutely appalling. And sadly, he continues in that disposition, and I think he owes the community an apology, not just for his time as Health Secretary, but for the manner and the lack of humanity and compassion that he showed when he gave evidence to this inquiry.
And disdain for the inquiry itself and its process.
One of the things that stands out in my mind from Lord Clark's evidence is that he asked, is Factor 8 a pill? He didn't even know what it was. And I actually used that as a way to ask the media to please assist with the public understanding about that product and why it's so dangerous, because it is fundamental to the report today.
Well, there you go. We were just listening there to a press conference. Some of the key campaigners in this infected blood scandal making their voices heard, really reacting to the publishing of that report today. Strong words. I felt the theme of cover-up was most strongly heard there. Lots of anger, frustration, and hope that perhaps this inquiry might lead to the recommendations being implemented.
Yes, and they spoke of the meaningless apologies that had been issued in the past, apologies without specifics. They're hoping now for apologies with specifics. But let's speak now to the reporter who first broke the infected blood scandal all the way back in 1983. Sue Douglas joins us now. And Sue, you as a tenacious young medical reporter for the Mail on Sunday got this story. How did you do it?
Well, gosh, it all seems so long ago now. It was the most extraordinary story, really, probably the biggest one I've ever had. And a friend of mine, when I was working in the medical press, doctors largely as an audience, and she'd stayed at that job, and I'd been moved on to the glory of Fleet Street and a medical correspondent on a new, as it was then, newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, looking for amazing investigative stories and to be the voice of their readers and the people. So I came across this story via this friend who'd been to a very boring drug conference, and there was a little gaggle afterwards at this Big Pharma funded conference about haematology. And it was, I don't even know exactly what it was all about, but at the time there was a small gaggle of scientists really worried at the bar. And she told me about this story, and this is how we together broke the story, and the Daily Mail picked up on it as well. So already the medical world knew that something very wrong was going on. So a few people, and my whistleblower, whose name remains in my heart and never ever published, basically were voicing serious concerns amongst their own kind, amongst haematologists, that blood that we were giving as life-saving treatments was actually infected and could ultimately kill people. So I was very obviously excited about this story, but horrified that this might be going on. The said whistleblower, who's probably one of the heroes in our story, rather than a journalist, although I think the fact that we can be the voice of those people we've just been listening to at that conference is extraordinary all those years later. That person was very brave because he risked his job, his reputation, by talking to me. And he did so anonymously, obviously. But at the time, I'd gone to talk to him, and I pretended, because I didn't think for a nanosecond he was going to talk to a journalist, I pretended I was a haematologist as well. And I was lucky in my background, I got away with it. Probably in the end he knew, because I wasn't a very good haematologist. And he told me, without knowing that I was busily making notes or recording some of our conversation, that he was seriously concerned that people were getting first hepatitis C, which was a very, very dangerous disease that's still resulting in a number of deaths all the time. And that horrible statistic of 3 per week is possibly a few less, but not many. And as many of the people at that press conference know, ongoing ticking time bombs of the results of their contamination. But most importantly at that time, and none of you are old enough to remember, AIDS was brewing. And AIDS was really the big killer disease that was sweeping through America. And at that point, we only knew that it was transmitted by blood, but we didn't really know how. So at the end of our meeting, he said, and I do know other people who are seriously concerned about people and patients in Britain who've had a blood transfusion, or more importantly, factor VIII to treat their haemophilia, and they are seriously sick. And I was absolutely desperate to copper bottom this story and actually let him know that I was a journalist. But again, at that point, I said, no, I'm not going to, and rushed back to the office. This was in Cardiff at the time. And we got a whole team on the story. I then phoned him and confessed, and he laughed and said I wasn't a very good haematologist anyway, but that I was to promise never to come to see him again and never, ever to reveal his name, which I didn't.
On that point, how much pushback was there from the medical establishment at this time, from those who were giving out this treatment? There must have been a huge amount of resistance to your work.
Well, what happened was there was that worry, but no one was voicing it. In the medical press, there was a bit. When we published that sensationalist headline, and I remember at 25, 26 years old thinking, oh my God, now what? Hospitals using killer blood. Now, there weren't many tabloid headlines as shocking as that. And the Press Council and doctors and Bloom and lots of other people came down on me and the newspaper like a ton of bricks. And basically, it was recommended that I should be sacked for being irresponsible and exposing people to the risk of their lives. So I might have been causing their deaths if they discontinued taking their treatment. Now, to be fair, some doctors may have thought that too, because what was the alternative? If my scaremongering had genuinely created people, and some of the people at that press conference and people I still talk to did stop and now say, Sue, you saved my life, which is an amazing thing to tell a journalist. But maybe some of them might have bled to death, because at that time we didn't have an alternative. But within a year, 2 years, 3 years, we did. And other countries were busy hurrying to get that alternative, and the heat treatments were viable. So the cover-up starts from the very beginning. The cover-up is amongst doctors perhaps frightened that there wasn't an alternative, and politicians genuinely scared that they were importing a very cheap but contaminated killer.
And Sue, did you, after you broke this story with that sensationalist headline, you received the pushback from the medical community, people wanting to essentially silence you. Did you continue to pursue this investigation? Did you continue to speak to other whistleblowers or other people in the medical community to find out more?
That's the million-dollar question, because at the time I was lucky it would be like any of you with this report saying, no, it's not true, stop it. And the establishment in all its glory, the drug companies, the doctors, the advisors, the care workers, everything was, no, it's not right, she's wrong. But my newspaper did think I was right, and we had enough evidence, and we had enough, not whistleblowers, because we had our one, and everyone else, to be brutally honest, was scared. And even my whistleblower at one point phoned me and said, and this is really important, I'm going to lose my job if anyone knows what I've been doing. But I'm going to tell you somebody else, and that was another person I've never named, so I only had the two real sources, who's got 2 patients now in a teaching hospital in London who are dying of AIDS because of the contaminated blood. So at each stage I was being handed, your point, to another one who was worried enough but was seriously scared, as at various points was I, but for very different reasons, that their reputation would be completely damaged and that they would be either sacked or just treated like a pariah.
It is just the most astonishing story, and Sue, I suppose the whole country has to thank you for your tenacity as a journalist in your 20s, going through all of that, with the weight of the British medical establishment against you. It's a really inspiring story, but Sue Douglas, thank you so much for speaking to us on this really important day. Thanks for your time.
Yes, it's very interesting indeed, particularly as we've been talking so much about whistleblowers within the NHS and how difficult it is for doctors, nurses, staff members to speak up when things go wrong when it comes to patient safety. This is a real-life example. Journalists trying to get to the bottom of something and finding so much pushback, so difficult for whistleblowers to come forward. Anyway, we've got some breaking news for you.
Yes, from the last few minutes, Julian Assange has won a bid at the High Court to bring an appeal against his extradition to the United States.
Yes, GB News reporter Ray Addison joins us now from the High Court. Ray, what does this mean for Julian?
Well, a huge outbreak of cheering, celebration, drums, chanting here from his supporters. There's hundreds of supporters here outside the Royal Courts of Justice when Julian Assange, as he said, has won that bid at the High Court to launch an appeal against his extradition to the United States. Now, that's despite US assurances to the court that if Assange is tried for spying there, he would receive a fair trial and would not face the death penalty. Now, much of the argument that we heard in court today hinged on whether he would be able to use the First Amendment as part of his defence in court. That's the right to freedom of speech. Now, also the second main reason why it was rejected was there was claims by Assange's lawyers that he would be discriminated against because he is not a US citizen. Now, the US Attorney General, in his response, said that he could seek, Assange could seek to rely on the First Amendment, but ultimately it was up to the US courts to decide whether they would allow him to do that or not. So it was not a guarantee. That's because of the separation of powers in the United States between the Attorney General and the US courts. They can ignore any promise that would have been made by the US Attorney General. Now, also, in some cases, freedom of speech, we heard, does not relate to national defence information. So that was another concern that Assange's lawyers brought to the attention of the court. Also, the KC, who was representing the United States, said that whilst there is protection for journalists and whistleblowers, it has to be based on the fact that they acted appropriately and acted reasonably. And so there was a huge question mark there over whether he would be able to use that defence. Now, the High Court judges ultimately said that these assurances provided by the United States were simply not sufficient, and they did grant an appeal for Julian Assange to appeal his extradition over those freedom of speech and nationality points. And as you can hear, a huge amount of celebration from his supporters after 13 years of Mr. Assange being variously on the run, being in house detention, seeking solace in the Ecuadorian embassy, and since 2019, of course, he's been locked up in Belmarsh prison as well. So Mr. Assange did not attend today's ruling. However, that was down to health grounds, we are told. However, he has got hundreds of supporters here, and you never know, he might be able to hear their cheers in Belmarsh.
Well, Ray Addison, it's been the most extraordinary story. It's been a long time coming, this. This could have been the last moment that this went through a British court, but now it will not be. And mainly on this grounds that he would be at risk of the death penalty in the United States, despite their assurances. What happens next?
Well, just to give you one point, Tom, the death penalty argument was accepted, that he would not face the death penalty. That was accepted by the court. It was the nationality and the freedom of speech arguments that specifically were quoted here by the High Court judges. Now, of course, if he'd lost this appeal today, there was genuine fears that he could have been put almost on the next plane to the United States. That now hasn't happened. We know that there will be a further hearing now where Mr. Assange will be able to give a full appeal against this extradition. And of course, this ruling today will give hope to his legal team and hope to all of his supporters, certainly here in the UK and around the world, that the judges have severe concerns about whether he can get a fair trial.
Well, the legal battle goes on. Thank you very much indeed, GB News reporter Ray Addison there outside the High Court. Fascinating to see how much support Julian Assange can still garner after all of these years.
From the High Court back to the infected blood inquiry, our reporter Catherine Forster is there on the scene and she has a guest with her because this has been the most extraordinary time, this most extraordinary moment. Indeed, the chairman of the Haemophilia Society, I believe, is with Catherine Forster now.
Yes, good afternoon, Tom and Emily. This 2,500-page report from Sir Brian Langstaff really couldn't be any more damning. He says there was a subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up and also the deliberate destruction of documents. It's had a devastating impact on many people's lives. 3,000 people already, as we know, have died, and I'm joined now by Andrew March. Now, Andrew was infected with HIV when he was 9 years old. Andrew, thank you very much for talking to us today on GB News. Can you just take us back to when you were 9? What happened when your family were told that you'd been given infected blood?
Well, the news came sort of gradually over, a period of a few months. But from that point, our family was changed beyond recognition. There's no frame of reference for what we would have been, what we could have been. Being infected with HIV, it's been life-changing and life-limiting, and I have absolutely no way of knowing what my life might have been like.
And at the time, the mid-1980s, there was a huge fear, wasn't there? There was no cure, and people were vilified. Were your family personally targeted? Did you get a hard time from people around you as well?
I think we became really isolated. I had some problems at school. I mean, one of the headmasters wanted to know if he had to disinfect the whole school. There was real problems with my parents being called in to know what to do. And I was still at middle school. So, no, it was not handled very well. And then it got worse in the 2 years that followed because we ended up with those dreadful adverts of, gravestones falling and icebergs melting and being chiselled away with pneumatic drills. And don't die of ignorance. Well, what's a 9-year-old meant to do to cope with that, to understand what's happening?
And we're here now in 2024, some 40 years on. What do you make of what you've heard from the report so far? Is there anything surprising here, or is it telling you basically what you knew already? It's
a huge vindication for what campaigners and ourselves have tried to say and claim has happened. The extent of the cover-up, the infectivity trials, the things that went on in the Trelaws school. I think it's a raft of failures. It's just failure after failure has been outlined by the report. It's totally delivered what we need to hear, and this is a chance for this to be resolved whilst most of the truth is coming out.
And what do you, thank you so much. I know this is incredibly difficult. So you're getting some answers at long last. You're going to get, we hear, an apology from the Prime Minister later this afternoon. There will be compensation. Of course, no amount of compensation can in any way make up for what has happened. But what are you hoping to hear? What are you wanting to happen now going forward?
I think it needs to be resolved, and I don't know. Some people want criminal avenues to be explored. I personally don't want any, punishment or to be levied or anything. I think if there's liability, it might need to be examined. But I think we've got a real opportunity to wrap this up, because I'm 50 now, and it's engulfed a lot of my life. We lost a lot of people along the way. So we need to get this sorted out. We need, you know, it's an opportunity whilst, you know, it looks like most of the truth's coming out.
Andrew March, thank you so much for talking to us today on GB News. I know you've waited for this day for a very, very long time. Really appreciate it. Back to you, Tom and Emily.
Just that. It's the human stories at the heart of all of this that really make you realise what's been going on, because to be 9 years old and for a blood transfusion be given HIV, the whole of your school be talking about it, parents coming in, people wanting you kicked out of the school, teachers saying they want to disinfect the whole place because of your presence. Unimaginable.
I mean, the way he said it's engulfed so many years of his life, so much of his life spent thinking about this, spent worrying about it, spent, I imagine, feeling all kinds of emotions. And the way he spoke about how it has been family-changing, life-changing. He doesn't know what his life would have been like without this. He was 9 years old. Incredible. Incredible to hear from one of the victims and the fact he said he's not too keen for any type of criminal avenues to be explored and that sort of thing, which is interesting too.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of people just want this to be over. After 4 or 5 decades of this, they just want it done.
Poor man. Yeah. Well, let's hear from the chairman of the Infected Blood Inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff.
The disaster was no accident. People put their trust in doctors and the government to keep them safe, and that trust was betrayed. And then the government compounded the agony by telling them that nothing wrong had been done, that they'd had the best available treatment, and that as soon as tests were available, they were introduced. And both of those statements were untrue. That's why what I'm recommending is that compensation must be paid now, and I've made various other recommendations to help to make the future of the NHS better and treatment safer.
Well, there we go.
Brian Langstaff there.
The man who led the inquiry, yes. It is his report. He has many recommendations in there now available for all to see. But stick with us, because we've got a lot to get through this afternoon. We're going to be returning to that breaking news. Julian Assange wins his bid to bring appeal against his extradition. What happens next? You're watching Good Afternoon Britain. We're on GB News.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Rishi Sunak has come out fighting and declared war on what he's called the UK's sick note culture. The country's welfare state bill costs the average taxpayer now £2,000 every single year for every British taxpayer. Astonishing numbers, Catherine, simply mind-bending. 69 billion quid every year now goes on benefits. I paid my tax bill last month. Where did your tax go? I clicked on it. Long-term sickness and benefits is now second only to the NHS on what we spend our tax pound on. This is simply unsustainable.
That's exactly what the Prime Minister said. 69 billion a year on long-term sick and disability benefits, projected to rise to 90 billion by the end of the next Parliament if nothing has done. As he said, it is totally, totally unsustainable. And the message from Rishi Sunak really is, tough love. You're going to take your medicine. It's going to be good for you. You may not like it. Let's have a look at what he had to say earlier.
Everyone with the potential should be supported, and not just to earn, but to contribute and belong. And we must never tolerate barriers that hold people back from making their contribution and from sharing in that sense of self-worth that comes from feeling part of being something bigger than ourselves. And that is why this is a moral mission, and why the value of work is so central to my vision for welfare reform.
Certainly, Rishi Sunak said in the speech, in the period since the pandemic, something has gone wrong. Of course, millions of people had their wages paid by furlough. Now, that was an entirely artificial situation in an exceptional circumstance, but quite a lot of people left the workplace and simply haven't come back.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News with Dubes & Co from 6, followed by Farage at 7. At 8, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg addresses the state of the nation. And at 9, join Patrick Christie's Tonight, followed by Headliners at 11. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 1:24. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now, Ebrahim Raisi, that's Iran's president, and his foreign minister have been killed in a dramatic helicopter crash.
Harsh weather conditions made it difficult for search teams to find the wreckage. Efforts by search teams, but it was eventually located in East Azerbaijan province, that province in Iran.
Yes, there has been no evidence of foul play, but Iran's supreme leader has declared 5 days of national mourning. An election for a new president is due to take place in the next 50 days.
Election with heavy inverted commas there, but GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White joins us now for the implications of what is undoubtedly a dramatic event. Mark, how does this affect the wider region and potentially us here in Britain?
Well, I don't think it really affects us all that much, at the moment at least. It is an internal issue for Iran now to look to secure the situation as far as the presidency is concerned. We know that the vice president is taking charge at the moment until a new presidential election can take place within 50 days. That candidate, whoever it is, will be carefully chosen by the hardliners who are in charge of the Iranian government in all spheres of the Iranian government. They are firmly in charge, and they will pick a candidate who is no doubt a hardliner that meets their requirements. So we await to see who that will be. There's talk that the Vice President himself could be in the running. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei's son, could also be one of the candidates. But we're still in the early stages. We've got a funeral for President Raisi to take place first. That will be taking place tomorrow amid these 5 days of mourning in Iran.
Mark, should we be surprised that Iran hasn't come out to say that this was Israel's fault?
Well, I think there was always a fear, especially in the early hours after this helicopter disappeared, that a finger of blame could be pointed elsewhere, and we really mean Israel here in terms of potential foul play. But the mood music, certainly from the authorities in Tehran at the moment, does not seem to be suggesting that they are suspicious about foul play at this stage anyway. But that could all change, depending as well, of course, on what the investigation uncovers. If it, for instance, starts to cast blame on officials on the way that the ageing helicopter fleet had been maintained, about their decision to fly the president of the country along with the foreign minister and other dignitaries in pretty atrocious weather in a mountainous region. If the pressure starts to mount there, it is possible that, you know, they could be starting to point the finger of blame elsewhere, but no indication of that as yet.
And there's a huge amount of discontent domestically, isn't there? Earlier you were talking to us about how the economy is in pretty dire way, in a pretty dire state, and of course there's huge amounts of repression.
Well, yes, and of course the man really at the helm over the last few years of the crackdown in Iran was President Raisi, a very unpopular figure amongst a good number of people in Iran who are fighting against the hardline repressive policies handed down by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. So there is always the potential for more unrest in the days ahead. And as you mentioned there, yes, the economy in Iran at the moment is in a fairly perilous state. They've got significant inflation at 40%. And of course, the sanctions that have been imposed, heavy sanctions on that country over the years, have taken their toll. And that all of that feeds in to general discontentment amongst significant portions of the population, both in Iran and the Iranian diaspora, who are now spread out around the world.
It is a hugely concerning issue because, of course, the current Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, is 85 years old. And, of course, the president was widely expected to succeed the Ayatollah. This now throws all of those rumoured plans up in the air, and big question marks now over this line of succession in a country that really sits at the heart of what has been variously described as an axis of evil.
Yes, I mean, certainly that's the information that seemed to have been fed out from apparent insiders in Iran, that Raisi was being lined up to take over from the Ayatollah in the years ahead. He is, as I say, in failing health. How true that was, we don't really know. It's pretty opaque in Iranian society, political, and particularly in the political sphere in Iran itself. But we wait to see what will happen, because clearly there are friends of Iran in the region. There are the proxies in that area that take instructions, of course, directly from Iran as well, who've been reacting with messages of condolence, but also lashing out with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon lobbing missiles over towards northern Israel. Today, Israel has now responded in kind, targeting a number of Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. So the hope is at least that it won't escalate from that. These tit-for-tat exchanges across the border from Lebanon into Israel are fairly common. They're almost a daily occurrence.
And this could, as you say, have wide-reaching consequences outside of Iran itself. As you mentioned, Iran is known for funding terrorism, funding proxies, not least Hamas and Hezbollah. Could a change of leader... Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Mark. I'm just going to cut into myself there, but thank you very much indeed. We're going to cross over to a press conference where more campaigners and victims of the infected blood scandal are now reacting to the inquiry.
Has done his job with a very much a degree of compassion, and he has got to the root of what has been happening over many years. He has made some very astute recommendations, and we look forward to the government responding to those in a positive way. We continue to be willing to contribute to that process.
Yes, well, I'd agree with John. We think it's a very thorough report, and Sir Brian has done an excellent job. Our main concern from Wales is what will the government do with the recommendations. From what the little I've seen of the report, because we've come up on a coach from Wales, so I've had a very quick look at it. It seems that there are lots of criticisms within it, and it seems that Wales mirrored what happened in UK government, and decisions were taken without much question. So our main concern obviously was the leading doctor in Wales, Professor Bloom is named in the report, and it seems that he decided the policies that were going to be adopted, and UK government did nothing other than accept them. And we've also noted that Diana Walford is criticised in the report. So, you know, it's very, very concerning that, you know, the factor concentrates, they were meant to, they should have at least been withdrawn by 1978, but they continued to be imported and they were used on children and newly diagnosed children. So it's all very concerning, but it isn't anything we didn't already know. We know that the patients were treated without consent. And it's just very worrying that government just accepted that, and there was no candour, there was no truthfulness, and that line was taken, and that continued.
As a transfusion victim, I've scanned it quickly, but in the first couple of pages in black and white, in 1965, Germany was looking at their blood donations for raised ALT levels. That was in 1965. If our government had taken that on, and anybody that donated with raised ALT and had taken those out of the donation line, then there would be a lot fewer transfusion victims nowadays. So it vindicates my impression that the knowledge was out there. Our government ignored it, couldn't be bothered with it, found it was going to be too expensive. I don't know what their excuses are, but this blatantly in black and white says that they have no excuses, that every person that died from those times on could have been saved if they'd done the risks and put them in place. So I'm really pleased that it's out there now. Nobody can call us conspiracy theorists. Our truth has been told, it's in black and white, and they've got no place to hide. Any government over the last 30 to 40 years needs to be called to account.
My name is Nigel Hamilton. I'm chairman of Haemophilia NI. I represent a small, if select, community in Northern Ireland. I lost my twin at Christmas Day. I lost 2 cousins within the past 10 years. I lost 2 friends within the past 2 months. We have suffered in Northern Ireland, and the production of this report, as it now comes, has been both healing and supportive. It recognises the injustices that have taken place. It gives us an opportunity to address some of those and try to apply some of the positives that we're going to find in this. But with 7 volumes and only having receipt of 2 and an opportunity to tease through the remaining 5 volumes on phone, it hasn't been easy to find the answers for you at this stage. What I will say is, interestingly, and it's something that's been going on for some time, and the government have now recognised that because of the Prime Minister's statement today and Minister Glenn's statement to a number of group representatives throughout the UK recently. Compensation will be paid. That is not an answer to the problems we have, nor is it a solution, but it will help. The other aspect that has come out of this for me is that while I feel a cascade of emotions, positive and negative, I think that it indicates quite clearly that the government are culpable, successive governments are culpable of neglect, of abandonment, and that unfortunately has been a culture which has also been adopted within the health service. I looked at Northern Ireland's report specifically, and I could see from that that it was evident that they followed suit from the leadership that was given in the UK mainland. And I think all regional health departments did. Our Assembly, or our government in Northern Ireland, was highlighted as having 2 problems, and that's why it couldn't deal with the issues. One of them was security, because there was a big emphasis by ministerial commitment on security. And the other issue was the fact that we have not had consistent government over a practical period of time, and I'm talking years. So Assembly has risen and Assembly has fallen, and Assembly has risen and fallen and has risen again. What they need to understand is they have to show leadership. In all the regions, they have to show leadership. And the one thing that seems to be abandoned here is that leadership and determination to identify the specific issues that impact on their communities have not taken place. So a culture change is required. Candour is required. And transparency, which will involve and engage the patients. I hope that from this report, other victim groups will be able to identify what mustn't happen to them, and the lessons that are provided in this report will be listened to and learnt by government, civil servants and the National Health Service.
Well, my name's Joyce Donnelly and I represent the Scottish Infected Blood Forum. Now, when this inquiry started, I had every faith in Sir Brian and his team, and he has lived up more than I could have expected. I haven't had that much time to look at the report. What I've seen, I read, I was particularly interested in the chapter in Scotland, and the recommendations that were made in Scotland 20 years ago by Lord Ross were never carried through. So one can only hope that these recommendations, and I don't see how they could refute it. How could they possibly refute these recommendations? They stand up. Everything that Sir Brian has put down stands up and has been clarified and proved to be correct. So these recommendations, one hopes, will be carried through to the letter, and people will receive what they should have received 20 years ago, 30 years ago. My late husband had this mantra in his life. He wouldn't apply for Skipton or anything else. He said, the government know what they've done, they know who they've done it to, and it's up to the government to put it right. And if the government can now put it right, then a lot of people have missed out, a lot of people have passed on and died in the interim, but there are still people who are waiting for it to be put right, and that is my hope for the future.
Hi, I'm Shelley Phelps from BBC Wales. I've got a question for Lynn, please. There's a lot of criticism in this report of Professor Bloom, who, as you were just talking about earlier, he led the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre. Can I get your reaction to those findings? Thank you.
Well, we've sort of known the truth for a long time. You know, this has been, a lot of it has been uncovered by the campaigners, but obviously the inquiry has put all this on public record. So the feeling of the group is, you know, it's still very much disbelief that you know, it's now in black and white, but it needed to be put on public record. That, you know, these things had happened. So there was testing without consent on children, and previously untreated patients were given concentrates when they shouldn't have been given concentrates, and that led to an infection of many, many more haemophiliacs than needed to have been infected at the time. So it's just very, very emotional, very, very upsetting for people, because many of the facts we've known for a long time, but to see it in black and white is particularly hard for our group to come to terms with.
Hi, Rachel Hall from The Guardian. Can you give me a sense for how victims and families will be feeling reading the report? And is this the moment that you and they were hoping for? And if there's anything else that you might be looking for going forward, for example, criminal charges?
So, as regards victims and families, obviously we've had limited viewing of the report because we've been on a coach for 4 hours, so it's been very difficult. But yeah, it's a feeling of, well, I suppose they now feel that they're believed, because it's something that people have been saying for so many years, and that in the large part is how we got the public inquiry. It's all the campaigning that was done by all the people before us who are no longer here, and so we felt it was our duty to carry on the campaign, because we knew the truth. Obviously, we've had a lot more revealed by the inquiry, but so there's some kind of feeling of closure. I think the difficulty is that nobody can bring back the people who have been lost, and that is the real, the heartbreaking thing about it. And then when people are actually now learning that this could have been avoided, when we've always been told it was unavoidable, you know, that troubles people immensely. I think our other issue is, because there's no trust in government, that even though we know that Rishi Sunak is going to apologise this afternoon and there's going to be an announcement tomorrow, we actually don't, once the announcement comes tomorrow on compensation, we don't actually know the details of that, and we have great concerns about that, because it will be an arm's length body, but the government will have already set up all the rules and regulations. So regarding eligibility criteria and appeals. And I think the difficulty now is that Sir Brian's recommendations may be overruled by government or ignored. And that's a real worry for people, that we may still have to keep fighting after 40 years of fighting. You know, so many people have lost their lives, and yet we still have to continue. So I think people are reticent because they've seen what's happened previously with governments, you know, with the way that the history has been rewritten, you know, that nothing had happened that shouldn't have happened. So I feel that the apology is important, but the next stage now of compensation, that is bothering a lot of people, because obviously they feel that they want recognition.
Can I come in on that?
Well, we've been listening to voices from the nations and regions showing that this is a scandal that affects all corners of the United Kingdom. Let's cross now to our political correspondent, Catherine Forster, who joins us outside the inquiry. And Catherine, this has been reverberating across every corner of our nation.
Yes, indeed it has. This 2,500-page report by Sir Brian Langstaff, and really it could not be any more damning than it is. He talks of a subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up, deliberate destruction of relevant documents, and he says that what happened could largely, though not entirely, have been avoided. And I have to report that it should have been. He also said that successive governments and authorities did not put patient safety first. Also, astonishingly, he says that the risks of hepatitis posed by blood transfusions or the use of plasma were known to the NHS prior to the NHS's inception in 1948. And the importation of Factor VIII products should never have been licensed in 1973. So this is decades before this happened. Bear in mind, these are blood products that were given in the 1970s and 1980s, right through to 1991. We knew that warnings had been given by the mid-80s. In fact, Kenneth Clarke, who was Health Secretary at the time, has been singled out for criticism. But now we hear also that, in fact, the product should never have been licensed in the first place, and in fact that some of the risks had been known decades earlier. It really is quite incredible. But meanwhile, an apology will be forthcoming from the Prime Minister, we understand, this afternoon. A compensation scheme will be outlined tomorrow, upwards of £10 billion. But of course, no amount of saying sorry or money can ever undo the terrible wrongs that have been inflicted on thousands of people. One more thing I should just add, Sir Brian Langstaff also says that there'll be many, many more people who have in fact been infected but are not yet aware.
And there are so many people named in this report, Catherine. So many people blamed, not just successive governments, but individuals too. Who? What are the chances, in your view, of any type of criminal conviction?
Well, it wasn't within the remit of the investigation of the inquiry to make recommendations for prosecution, but no doubt the Crown Prosecution Service will be looking at this report very closely, I should imagine. Of course, there will be many, many doctors, many officials, etc., who made decisions, who, as we now know, deliberately covered up or destroyed documents or didn't tell patients about risks that they knew were very real, who have already passed away and so will never be held to account. But there may well be others who are still alive. So I think that's something that is quite possible. It has happened in other countries, but early days yet, although of course this is a scandal that has been half a century in the making.
Well, Catherine Forster, thank you so much for bringing us all that outside the infected blood inquiry location. It has been the most extraordinary few decades, really, in this process. But stick with us, because coming up, this extraordinary, unexpected ruling from the High Court. Julian Assange has won his bid to fight extradition to the United States on espionage charges. We're going to hear from his wife. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain here on GB News.
Britain's newsroom. Weekday mornings from 9:30.
So, a private members club in London, the Garrett Club, has voted to allow women members for the first time in its history.
So it's been around for 193 years. Women were not allowed as members, but they could go in as guests of male members. But there was a vote last night. 60% said time to allow women in on equal terms.
We don't really care about being part of a stuffy boys' club, and to join us to talk about this is Georgia Gilhole. Good morning, Georgia. Do women care about this? Have The Guardian got nothing better to do?
Apparently not, considering we have a huge range of domestic and global crises ongoing at the moment. I think, first and foremost, this was a campaign. It's been successful now by and for elites. I believe the chief reporter at The Guardian who spearheaded this was Amelia Gentleman.
That's right.
And in the initial coverage, she didn't even mention that her father-in-law, I believe, Stanley Johnson, obviously the father of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a very influential member of the Tory party. She didn't mention that he was a member, which I find bizarre. It's something that should have gone on that list if it was a list of influential members, which it was.
So hang on a minute, who's that?
Amelia Gentleman wrote the story in The Guardian. She's married to Joe Johnson, Boris's brother.
Boris's brother.
And so Stanley is a member of the Garrett, but she omitted that from her piece.
Ah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the majority of British women won't have even heard of the Garrett Club, nor any sort of private members clubs in London. It's a very kind of elite inside thing.
It's actors, lawyers, writers.
Yeah, and I think they absolutely have their place, especially for networking with people in different careers or the same career as you. I think they have their place, holding charity events, that kind of thing, and conferences.
We already have members' clubs mixed, and that stuff is still not happening. Just putting men and women together in this one space isn't going to help women in terms of cross-gender networking.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's just gone 10-2. Now, Julian Assange has won a bid at the High Court to bring an appeal against his extradition to the United States.
Yes, the WikiLeaks founder faced High Court judges today in a long-running legal battle to avoid extradition to the United States. This has been going on for more than 13 years now.
Well, GB News reporter Ray Addison joins us now from outside the High Court, where there's a scene of jubilation, it must be said, Ray.
Yeah, it really is. There's a bit of a circus atmosphere down here now. Of course, we've got all the official organisers, but we also have crowds and crowds of supporters. We've got people dressed up in orange jumpsuits like Guantanamo Bay. We've got a man walking around holding a placard offering free hugs, and just everybody seems to have come down here to celebrate and enjoy this decision, this ruling by those two High Court judges that Julian Assange can now appeal against that extradition. Now, it was all seemed to be based on whether or not he could receive a fair trial if he was removed to the United States. Now, much of the argument hinged on whether he'd be able to use the First Amendment, that's the right to freedom of speech, as part of his defence, and also would he or would he not be discriminated against based on the fact that he's not a US citizen. Now, the US Attorney General in their submissions and the case UKC that represented the United States here said that Assange could seek to rely on the First Amendment, but ultimately it was up to the US courts, and much was made of that by Assange's legal team. They're saying, well, hold on, due to this separation of powers, yes, the Attorney General can recommend, can say that they want him to be able to use the First Amendment, but ultimately the judges can rule for themselves, and so there very much was a big question mark over that element of the ruling. Now, Julian Assange's wife, Stella, has spoken after the hearing. This is what she had to say.
The judges reached the right decision. We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it. The United States should read the situation and drop this case now. Now is the moment to do it. Just abandon this shameful attack on journalists, on the press and the public that has been going on for 14 years.
Well, as we've heard there, very much the supporters very much calling now on President Biden to end this now after 13 years and simply drop the case against Assange. In fact, supporters here are saying he should be released immediately from prison and should receive the Nobel Peace Prize, no less. Mr. Assange was not here today because he was too unwell to attend the hearing. However, the cheering may have been audible in Belmarsh Prison, which is where he currently resides.
Ray Addison, thank you very much for all of that. Much more to come, including the latest from Iran. Don't go anywhere.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Today, many areas fine, dry and quite warm in the sunshine, but a few thunderstorms breaking out, particularly across Northern Ireland this afternoon. Low pressure to the north and to the south, high pressure up to the northeast. We're in a kind of pressure no man's land, which means the winds are light, but enough of a breeze on the eastern coast to bring some mist and low cloud. Quite a grey start for many too, and some cloud will be fairly persistent over northern England and southern Scotland today. And then we're looking at a few showers breaking out, particularly some lively downpours across the west of Northern Ireland. But for many it stays dry and fine, some sunny spells and temperatures getting into the low 20s across the south, quite a bit cooler on some of those North Sea coasts. Small chance of one or two showers breaking out across southern England, maybe West Wales, but they'll be very hit and miss. Many areas here will just stay dry, as I say, in the sunshine. Still feeling pretty warm even into the evening. Chance of a shower or two over northern parts of Wales, but a much greater risk of some intense downpours over Northern Ireland. These thundery showers here could cause some disruption. Most of Scotland, though, dry and fine, a little cool, perhaps on the east coast and across the Northern Isles, but generally temperatures in the high teens well inland in the sunshine. Now, as we go through the night, we'll start to see a few more changes. The cloud thickening up across eastern England. We'll see a few more showers breaking out over East Anglia, spreading towards the Midlands. And later in the night, the cloud thickening across the southeast also. Some mist and low cloud returning to the coast of northeast Scotland. Inland here, temperatures well down into single figures, but elsewhere, mostly staying in double digits. On to Tuesday's weather, a real mishmash, quite a grey day over the Midlands, some outbreaks of rain spreading towards northwest England and North Wales, and again the chance for some heavy thundery showers in the afternoon, particularly over southwest England, but also again maybe for Northern Ireland, more cloud and rain coming into the east too. With much more cloud around tomorrow, it won't be as warm either, but still into the 20s in the southwest.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
The next Great British Giveaway winner could be you, with a massive £20,000 in tax-free cash to be won. Imagine how you'd react getting that winning call from us.
Oh my God, are you joking? Not a line, I've never won a penny in my life.
I don't know what to say.
Do you know what? I've never won anything like this in my life. Oh my God. Oh God. Oh, it shocks me. This is amazing.
For another chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text PRIZE to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. or post your name and number to GB05 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me. My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country. That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Monday, the 20th of May.
A subtle, pervasive, chilling cover-up. The damning judgment by the report into the infected blood scandal. The inquiry found it was no accident. Thousands died. We'll have the details, reaction from the victims, and analysis of what went wrong.
It's Judgment Day for Julian Assange. His final appeal to the UK High Court, well, they've decided that he has won it. Indeed, Julian Assange will be fighting on to stay in the UK, defeating those charges at this stage. But there's much more to come. This is not the end of the road. We'll bring you all as it happens.
And Iran's president and foreign minister have been killed in a dramatic helicopter crash. We're asking, what does this mean for the region, the war in the Middle East, and for Britain?
Three enormous stories today, and through it all, we want your views, comments and thoughts. gbnews.com/your say is the way to get involved in the discussion.
Yes, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about Julian Assange. He will not be, as it stands, extradited to the United States. What do you make of that judgment? Apparently it is on the grounds that he is not a US citizen, so therefore he may be discriminated against in the United States, and also on that freedom of speech factor too.
Exactly. So the precise issue here is that whilst the US was happy to give assurances that he would not be subject to the death penalty, the executive of the United States did not give assurances that he would be tried as a US citizen would be tried, i.e. with the protections of the Constitution above him. If he's being tried as a foreigner, as we've seen with many instances of foreigners being tried in the United States or in territories of the United States, including Guantanamo Bay, they do not have those amendments, the Bill of Rights, protecting them in the United States. So if he's not going to be treated as a US citizen, that means the First Amendment or even further later amendments, the Fourth, etc., no longer apply to him.
It's interesting. If you're just joining us, we were outside the High Court with Ray Addison, our reporter, and huge amounts of celebrations there. There are people that have been committed to this from the start, who have backed Julian Assange throughout this all, who will be feeling rather emotional today, as you can see, celebrating this. Others think he should be extradited to the United States. So do let us know. gbnews.com/your say is the way to get in touch. But let's get your headlines with Tatiana.
Emily, thank you. The top stories this hour. The infected blood inquiry has found there was a deliberate destruction of documents by government officials, and the scandal could have largely been avoided. The final report documented a catalogue of failures which had catastrophic consequences, with patients knowingly exposed to unacceptable risks of infection. More than 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C between 1970 and the early 1990s by contaminated blood products and transfusions. The inquiry also found children were used as objects for research, with the risks ignored at a specialist school where boys were treated for haemophilia. The inquiry's chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, says the damage is still happening.
Deaths keep on happening week by week. What I've found is that disaster was no accident. People put their trust in doctors and the government to keep them safe, and that trust was betrayed. And then the government compounded the agony by telling them that nothing wrong had been done, that they'd had the best available treatment, and that as soon as tests were available, they were introduced. And both of those statements were untrue.
Victims say they've been waiting decades to be heard.
Sometimes we felt like we were shouting into the wind during these 40 years. When we told people, they didn't believe us. They said this wouldn't happen in the UK. But today proves that it can happen in the UK, and it did happen in the UK. And I just feel validated and vindicated.
I think everybody today has read of the disasters that unfolded, and Sir Brian has been very thorough and has not minced his words.
This was systemic. This was by government, by civil servants and by healthcare professionals. I think that really rocks what we think of as society and really challenges the trust that we put in people to look after us, to do their best and protect us. None of that can we take for granted anymore.
To other news, Julian Assange has won a legal bid to bring an appeal against his extradition to the United States. The High Court ruled that US assurances over his case were unsatisfactory and he would get a full appeal hearing. The WikiLeaks founder faces prosecution in the United States over an alleged conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defence information after the publication of hundreds of thousands of leaked documents relating to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Mr. Assange's wife is calling on the US to drop what she says is a shameful case.
It is 7 volumes. There's quite a lot of detail in it. What it comes to is this. In families across the UK, people, adults and children, were treated in hospital and at home with blood and blood products, and that NHS treatment resulted in over 30,000 people being infected with viruses which were life-shattering. Over 3,000 have already died, and that number is climbing week by week. For everyone involved, the evidence given to this inquiry has been difficult to listen to. No, that's the wrong word. It's hard for those centrally involved, and it must have been hard for many observing. But it has been much harder still for those who were recounting their own experiences, or listening to stories which touched a nerve, which brought back memories they would rather have forgotten, but which they brought themselves to tell the inquiry because the truth was important to tell. The harm that was done to people cannot adequately be put into words. I've tried. But patients, parents watch their children suffer and in many cases die. Children witnessed the decline and the death of one, sometimes both, parents, and their lives were irrevocably altered as a result. People had to care for their grievously ill partners or other family members, often at the expense of their own health and careers. Early on, in particular, they had to do so whilst being shunned, or worse, abused, by neighbours, workmates, by people they had once thought of as their friends, sometimes even by health professionals. The inquiry is not just investigating something which happened years ago, it is still happening. People still have to care for the after effects of what their loved ones still suffer. The grief, the trauma which all of those lost loved ones experienced continues to this day. The early treatments for HIV and hepatitis C were often worse than the illnesses themselves. The side effects linger, and for a number of those infected with hepatitis C, the damage done over so many years to their liver has left them at risk of developing cancer and requiring liver transplants. Every aspect of their lives has been defined by their infections: childhood, education, career, leisure, relationships, marriages, home ownership, travel, finances. Dreams and ambitions have been lost, relationships broken. True, though each of these consequences is, it really takes a person who has lived and is living with them to describe them in a way which brings home the full horror of what had happened. And that's why, in this report, I've tried to record people's experiences in some detail, where I can, using their own words. They're better than mine. Those experiences have been central to this inquiry's work and must be central to the response to this report. But I could not record every individual story in this report. I hope, therefore, that the thousands of statements which speak to people's suffering and endurance, which will remain accessible on the inquiry's website, along with the transcripts and recordings of the oral evidence which the inquiry heard, will ensure that their voices and their pain are never forgotten, and will move future listeners and readers as they have moved so many during this inquiry. This disaster was not an accident. People put their faith in doctors and in the government to keep them safe, and their trust was betrayed. There are generally two elements to any major public inquiry: one backward-looking, what happened and why; the other forward-looking, what next? How do we stop it happening again? This inquiry is different. There is another third element to this inquiry's terms of references. What was the response of government and others in authority to what had happened? Here, the NHS and successive governments compounded the agony by refusing to accept that wrong had been done. More than that, the government repeatedly maintained that people received the best available treatment, and that testing of blood donations began as soon as the technology was available, and both claims were untrue. That means that part of the what next, how do we stop it happening again, is not only taking steps to meet any threat of future infection carried by blood products or tissue, but how to ensure, as far as we can, that government responds to the citizens it serves, how shall I put this, more appropriately, in a way which reflects the true facts. To turn back to what the report says then about why infections happened on such a scale over such a time to so many people. The picture is a complex one, and the failings were multiple. First, governments, blood services, doctors knew at least 80 years ago, since the mid-1940s, that blood could transmit hepatitis, and that this was a significant disease which could lead to cirrhosis, liver failure, liver cancer, and death. This was not something kept to the dusty libraries of academic knowledge. The consultant advisor on blood transfusion to the chief medical officer wrote in 1946 that users of plasma must be told that it is a potentially lethal fluid which should be used with discretion. A 1964 circular from the Scottish Home and Health Department said, "No transfusion should be undertaken unless the benefits outweigh the risks of hepatitis." One of the leading transfusion directors used to write on the boards for students, "Blood can kill." The risk was not limited to hepatitis, but it included the risks of future unknown viruses. And in the light of that knowledge, you might expect action to be taken to reduce the risks which were known of, and a keen eye to be kept open in case new risks started to emerge. What happened was not that. Tragically, the infections happened because those in authority, doctors, the blood services, and successive governments, did not put patient safety first. They lost sight of what was known about the risks of viral infections from blood. Doctor knows best was such a strong belief that health departments did not issue guidance to curb the unsafe use of blood and blood products. Decision-making on measures that could make blood and blood products safer was put off, then dragged out unnecessarily, and failed to reach clear and decisive conclusions. And patients were simply not given the information they needed to make fully informed decisions about their own treatments. As long ago as 1952, the World Health Organization identified how to reduce the risks of transmitting hepatitis through blood and blood products. UK medical and government advisors took a central part in this. There were 4 key measures highlighted by the World Health Organization on which, despite its involvement in identifying them, the United Kingdom fell short. The first was the selection of donors. The second was restricting the size of the pools used to make plasma products. The third was treating plasma products, for example with heat, to reduce infection. And the fourth, maintaining good records and reporting infections. Each of these is addressed in detail in the report, and I shall say a little more about some aspects of each of them now. But the key point is that if we had followed the World Health Organization's advice, there would have been fewer infections from blood and from blood products and fewer deaths. As to the selection of donors, everyone who received blood or products made from blood plasma depended on the quality of the donations which ended up in their veins. Now that depended on donors. Knowing your donor and the risks that might come with their blood is fundamental to any system of collecting blood. The blood used for transfusions and to make blood products in the UK was from British donors who could and should have been better selected. For instance, in 1975, the Chief Medical Officer for England said the practice of collecting blood in prisons could continue, even though prisoners were known to have higher numbers of hepatitis infections. And this practice was not ended in the UK until 1984. For instance, No real efforts were made to prevent those who'd used intravenous drugs and who were therefore a higher risk of hepatitis from donating blood. And for instance, the steps taken to keep donors who are more likely to be incubating AIDS out of the donation chain were late in starting, and when they finally began, were inadequate. As for pool sizes, the dangers of pooling plasma from many donors were established by the Medical Research Council in 1944. The greater the number of donors to a pool, the greater the risk from it, because one infected donation could contaminate the whole pool. In 1951, the textbook that was then the Bible of blood transfusion said, "The use of large pool plasma has, of course, been abandoned." The use of only small pools lasted until after 1970. Then, however, something extraordinary happened. Just as the long-term seriousness of hepatitis became more and more apparent, the size of pools used to make UK blood products grew ever larger and larger, and with that, so too did the risk. Instead of reducing the risk, the UK was steadily increasing it. Blood donors in the UK gave blood freely, purely for the good of other people unknown to them, and they deserve praise for that. By contrast, the blood supplied in the United States was largely sold by people who needed the money. The hepatitis that gave rise to, and the number of deaths that followed, resulted in the US authorities banning sales of whole blood for transfusion in 1973. But the US authorities did not stop people selling their plasma to pharmaceutical companies to be made into blood products. In 1973, the UK licensing authority gave the green light to the importation and distribution of an American blood product and an Austrian blood product also made using paid donations, despite the manufacturers making no secrets of the risks of hepatitis they posed. The licensing authority knew of the risks from sales of blood plasma from people who, and I quote, did not inspire confidence and were motivated by money. The licensing authority knew, too, that these products were made from very large pools. The risks of hepatitis were freely admitted by the makers. I have concluded that the UK was wrong to decide to license these products in 1973, and later decisions in the 1970s to grant further licenses for similar US products were also wrong. Those products should simply not have been permitted to be distributed generally in this country. Despite the World Health Organization's reminder in 1952 of the importance of record keeping, poor record keeping has been a problem across many of the issues examined by the inquiry. This had an impact on safety. If you can't trace the source of his transfusion back to the donor who was infected, you cannot then tell and treat the donor and avoid any further donations from that source, nor can you trace previous donations to check if other people who have had transfusions from the same source have then become ill. And reporting of infections did not have the priority it should have done. For instance, at the height of the AIDS crisis, the North London Blood Transfusion Centre had to ask the government committee responsible for AIDS 3 times to arrange for the chief medical officer to ask doctors to find out if AIDS patients had previously donated blood. As well as the more rigorous selection of donors, and until such time as direct tests specific to hepatitis C and HIV were available, a further way of reducing the chances that hepatitis C or HIV would get into the blood supply and be transfused was to test for certain markers in the blood which could help identify the donations that might be infected. This was known as surrogate testing. The opportunity of this surrogate testing in the case of HIV was lost. In respect of hepatitis C, taking a decision about it was put off, and then delayed until it was simply too late. One doctor involved, rightly, described the process as going round in very small circles, some distance away from the target. Nearly 4 years were lost, during which the risks could have been very significantly reduced. The government was to claim in the 1990s that the direct tests for these viruses were introduced as soon as the technology was available. That was wrong in the cases of each of the viruses. In case of HIV, a test had been developed by August 1984. But it was not introduced for the screening of blood donations until October 1985. It takes time to produce such a test in sufficient quantity to screen all blood donations and to check its reliability, but I have concluded that we lost months for no clear reason by delays and indecision when setting up a process to evaluate each available make of test. Yet a number were commercially available and being used elsewhere in the world. Patients receiving transfusions in the UK were needlessly exposed to the risk of HIV as a result. In the case of hepatitis C, the delays were even worse. Screening of blood donations was not introduced until September 1991. Even when a screening test was available and approved, its use had to wait till all regions could introduce it on the same date, in other words, going at the pace of the slowest. When the government claimed that screening for hepatitis C had been introduced as soon as the technology became available, they ignored the long list of countries that introduced screening before the UK. Japan, Australia, France, Luxembourg, Finland, the US, Austria, the Netherlands, Canada, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy. Shall I go on? Spain, Norway, Sweden, Portugal, Cyprus, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Malta, and Denmark. 23. Just because the Department of Health hoped what they said was true, didn't mean to say it was. You might have thought that as soon as a screening test for hepatitis C was introduced across the board in September 1991, donors who were infected and might not have realized it could be identified and told, and that anyone who'd previously been given their suspect blood could be traced and checked. Well, you would have been wrong. It took around 4 years for there to be a general look back like this. One transfusion director, that's Dr. Jack Gillan, Edinburgh of South East Scotland, thought this was so unethical that he arranged to conduct a look back in his area. He had to call it a pilot study, but he wanted to do it and did it. His work deserves praise.
Well, we've been hearing from the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff. He's been speaking in central London about the outcome of all of this. Let's go now to our reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, this is a really significant moment.
That's right, Tom, and we were just hearing so many of the missed chances to intervene and get a grip on this scandal throughout the early timeline of when it arose. And they've been described as missed opportunities elsewhere, but the report is very clear that these misses were not accidental, that this was a deliberate failure in so many cases by not only major institutions like the NHS and the Department of Health, but also some specific individuals. And one of the many concerns for the survivors and victims we've been hearing from today is that they want accountability. Part of that is compensation, of course, but it's also about prosecution. They want justice to be delivered, but so many of the people that were at the centre of causing this appalling scandal have now passed away. They have been deceased, and so it's impossible to reach out there and achieve that significant amount of justice that they're demanding. But also, we've also heard a report this morning about the year in which this inquiry was launched, 2017. Prime Minister Theresa May brought it on. But it was revealed at 12:30 today that there was sufficient public interest and evidence to launch this inquiry from 1986. And that's when HIV testing was regularly introduced for donor blood. For hepatitis C, it was introduced in 1991, but by then there was 5 more years of significant evidence pointing towards this crisis. The report recommends that anyone who's had a blood transfusion before 1996, should seek a test for hepatitis C. It's a simple finger prick method, but they're calling on people to do that because of how many years that scandal had gone on while that evidence was available. So the campaigners are asking for that justice. The interim report in 2022 recommended significant compensation. It was a unexpected and unprecedented move for a report, an official inquiry, to make a demand of the government at that time. And that was for £100,000 to be paid to some 4,000 people who were involved in the scandal. But there is now an enlarged call for compensation, because it's not only those who are directly affected, but also the parents and the children. Because some children lost not only one, but both of their parents. So many parents went on to infect their loved ones by virtue of doctors withholding information about HIV infection. So the network of those affected has expanded today.
Charlie, a lot of us will be shocked by the scale of this scandal, the scale of the cover-up too, and of course the scale of the harm. You mentioned there may be scope for criminal prosecution. Do you imagine that the police will start investigating what's in this report?
Well, there was, as the report has said, a deliberate, subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up here. It wasn't just the sort of direct orders that is typical in an institutional cover-up, but a widespread culture of this can't be known. We also heard about the deliberate destruction of documents. It'll be interesting to know whether the CPS recommend charges if anyone is named in that process. And as the report has uncovered, some 7 volumes, as we saw at the start of Sir Brian's address there. More information will come to light on that. We're not expecting the Prime Minister to meet the families and victims today in a potentially controversial move. He'll be addressing Parliament later tonight and then making interviews and meetings with those families tomorrow. But as more detail comes out, I'm sure there will be a significant public pressure for any named individuals remaining from this period to face some form of prosecution, because that is a key part of the justice that these campaigners are demanding.
Well, Charlie Peters, thank you so much for bringing us the very latest there on what is a momentous day for many, many people involved in this scandal.
Yes, we'll bring you more reaction and more highlights from that speech, that powerful speech being made by the chair of this inquiry. Coming up, we're also going to bring you the latest from Iran, where the President, Ebrahim Raisi, and his foreign minister have been killed in a dramatic helicopter crash. What impact does this have on the region? And here, that's to come after your headlines with Tatiana.
Emily, thank you. The top stories. The infected blood inquiry has found there was a deliberate destruction of documents by government officials, and the scandal could have largely been avoided. The final report documented a catalogue of failures which had catastrophic consequences, with patients knowingly exposed to unacceptable risks of infection. More than 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C between 1970 and the early 1990s by contaminated blood products and transfusions. The inquiry's chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, says the damage is still happening.
Deaths keep on happening week by week. What I've found is that disaster was no accident. People put their trust in doctors and the government to keep them safe, and that trust was betrayed. And then the government compounded the agony by telling them that nothing wrong had been done, that they'd had the best available treatment, and that as soon as tests were available, they were introduced. And both of those statements were untrue.
Julian Assange has won a legal bid to bring an appeal against his extradition to the United States. The High Court ruled that US assurances over his case were unsatisfactory and he would get a full appeal hearing. The WikiLeaks founder faces prosecution in the United States over an alleged conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defence information after the publication of hundreds of thousands of leaked documents relating to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Iran has confirmed the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and his foreign minister were killed in a helicopter crash. Footage obtained by Iranian media shows the crash site on a mountainside. Harsh weather conditions hampered efforts by search teams, but the wreckage was eventually located in the East Azerbaijan province. Iran's supreme leader has declared 5 days of national mourning. An election for a new president is due to take place in the next 50 days. And for the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Time for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. Today, many areas fine, dry and quite warm in the sunshine, but a few thunderstorms breaking out, particularly across Northern Ireland this afternoon. Low pressure to the north and to the south, high pressure up to the northeast. We're in a kind of pressure no man's land, which means the winds are light, but enough of a breeze on the eastern coast to bring some mist and low cloud. Quite a grey start for many too, and some cloud will be fairly persistent over northern England and southern Scotland today. And then we're looking at a few showers breaking out, particularly some lively downpours across the west of Northern Ireland. But for many it stays dry and fine, some sunny spells and temperatures getting into the low 20s across the south, quite a bit cooler on some of those North Sea coasts. Small chance of 1 or 2 showers breaking out across southern England, maybe West Wales, but they'll be very hit and miss. Many areas here will just stay dry, as I say, in the sunshine. Still feeling pretty warm even into the evening. Chance of a shower or 2 over northern parts of Wales, but a much greater risk of some intense downpours over Northern Ireland. These thundery showers here could cause some disruption. Most of Scotland, though, dry and fine, a little cool, perhaps on the east coast and across the Northern Isles, but generally temperatures in the high teens well inland in the sunshine. Now, as we go through the night, we'll start to see a few more changes. The cloud thickening up across eastern England. We'll see a few more showers breaking out over East Anglia, spreading towards the Midlands. And later in the night, the cloud thickening across the southeast also. Some mist and low cloud returning to the coast of northeast Scotland. Inland here, temperatures well down into single figures, but elsewhere, mostly staying in double digits. On to Tuesday's weather, a real mishmash, quite a grey day over the Midlands, some outbreaks of rain spreading towards northwest England and North Wales, and again the chance for some heavy thundery showers in the afternoon, particularly over southwest England, but also again maybe for Northern Ireland, more cloud and rain coming into the east too. With much more cloud around tomorrow, it won't be as warm either, but still into the 20s in the southwest.
The latest GB News travel.
Good afternoon, I'm John Vincent. Slow traffic for the M5 northbound in the West Midlands looking to join the M6 at junction 8. The M4 westbound near Bristol still queuing there after an earlier accident between junction 19, the M32 into Bristol, and 20, the Almsby interchange, although all lanes have reopened. And there's also queues a little further back between junction 18 Bath and 19 for the M32 as a result of a broken down vehicle. There's a lane closure there. Slow traffic on the M25 anti-clockwise in Buckinghamshire. That's due to an earlier broken down truck at junction 16 for the M40. Traffic still struggling in Kent on the M26 westbound in the roadworks just before the M25, and we're seeing queuing traffic also on the M25 anti-clockwise, this time in Essex between junction 26 Waltham Abbey and 25 for Enfield, again down to roadworks. And that's the latest traffic and travel news.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
Right, it's 2:36 and coming up at 3 o'clock, as always, is Martin Dobney. Martin, absolutely huge news day for us today. What have you got coming up?
Yeah, furthering your excellent coverage of the infected blood scandal inquiry, I'll also be joined by victims and family members who lost relatives in this scandal, as well as campaigners to say, is this enough? Should it go further? Can justice ever be done? I'll also look over again at the situation in Ireland. Crazy scenes over there. The Irish Taoiseach says that he wants to recognise the Palestinian state by the end of the month. But do locals care? Well, what they really care about is a story I'm going to cover today, where locals turned around a planned caravan park for asylum seekers. They blockaded the road and stopped it going ahead. I'll be joined by an activist who was there. Plus, a new report out shows that Wales's controversial 20-mile-an-hour blanket ban did absolutely nothing to cut air pollution. I'll be joined by a Senedd shadow transport minister, and I'll be asking them, was the entire thing just a cash cow? That's all coming 3 till 6 p.m.
Sounds really interesting, Martin. I suppose on this 20-mile-an-hour issue, it stands to reason, doesn't it? You force cars to go slower, much more pollutant will be getting out for the same amount of time.
Yeah, and the cars are in a lower gear, and a lower gear puts higher revs. It churns out more pollution. It's almost, Tom, like nobody thought this through. All they wanted to do instead was find the motorist once again. But hopefully the entire thing will get junked and we'll have a return to common sense.
Well, no one is going to want to miss your show coming up, Martin. Great stuff. See you at 3. Excellent. Well, are we going to take a little quick break? Now?
No, we're going to talk about Julian Assange, who has won his bid at the High Court to bring an appeal against his extradition to the United States.
Well, the WikiLeaks founder faced High Court judges today in a long-running legal battle to avoid extradition to the United States. Now, this has been going on for more than 13 years. Ray Addison is here for us outside the High Court. Ray, you were reporting earlier, lots of celebration. Are those people still there?
A large amount of them are still here. However, the majority of the organisers have now moved on. They said they were off to the pub to celebrate. So they've taken down the stage and they've headed off. We've got some people just off camera to my right-hand side who are dancing and singing on the microphone. A number of people still here. However, the vast majority have now moved off to continue their celebrations elsewhere. And of course, it is a really big, important day for the supporters of Julian Assange. He had been seeking permission to appeal that extradition to the United States, and the High Court here, the judges had sought assurances from the US Attorney General that Assange would receive a fair trial if he was removed from this country. Now, it hinged on 3 things. Firstly, would he be subject to the death penalty? Secondly, would he be able to use the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech, as part of his defence? And secondly, would he be unduly dealt with because he is not a US citizen? Now, on the issue of the death penalty, the judges rejected that argument from Julian Assange's legal team. However, they did accept the 2 concerns on the issue of freedom of speech and the issue of his nationality. And it kind of hinged with a comment that was put forward by the KC representing the United States, which said that Mr. Assange could seek to use the First Amendment in his defence when extradited, not that it would be necessarily accepted by whichever judge ended up hearing his case. And that seems to be a really, really crucial distinction, which the judges have decided to give further attention when they have a full hearing for this appeal. Now, as you were saying, much celebration down here, hundreds of supporters, including Julian Assange's wife, Stella. She spoke on the steps outside the Royal Courts of Justice after that verdict. This is what she had to say.
The judges reached the right decision. We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it. The United States should read the situation and drop this case now. Now is the moment to do it. Just abandon this shameful attack on journalists, on the press and the public that has been going on for 14 years.
Now, of course, through WikiLeaks, Julian Assange is accused of releasing hundreds of thousands of classified military documents, and that, they said, the US says, caused severe problems for their sources and their agents. However, now his supporters are saying that President Biden needs to stop this case and they should free Julian Assange for good.
absolutely fascinating, Ray Addison. You've been outside the High Court for us. Thank you very much indeed.
This is such an interesting case because I wasn't expecting it to go this way for Julian Assange today, particularly as all of these assurances have been given by the United States on the death penalty. But clearly it was one not on the death penalty, but on those other issues that he won't be treated as a United States citizen and therefore won't get the protection of the United States Constitution.
Yeah, just looking at the inbox on gbnews.com/your say, lots of strong feelings about this. I'd say the majority think that Julian Assange probably should have been extradited to the United States, but there are those who believe that this is a matter of freedom of the press and that he's been wrongly accused.
And yet, did he do the work of a journalist when he dumped all of that data without any retractions, without sifting through? It was a data dump online of classified information. Now, a journalist might well have read through all that information and decided what was in the public interest to publish and withheld what might have endangered people's lives or wasn't in the public interest. This was a data dump rather than any sort of journalistic work. And so I do wonder when people say this is a journalist who's being pursued by a state. Is it really?
Well, that's the question. That is a very important question to ask. Dumping information, not really the same as investigative journalism, is it really? We're going to park this for one moment. We'll be back after the break talking about the very latest from Iran. The president killed in a catastrophic helicopter crash.
I'm Nana Akua. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Nana Akua, weekends from 3 p.m.
Next up, though, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, did not see Charles during the trip to London this week. It was reported, according to the Times, there are different versions of the story, depending on who asked who, whether they should see who. It's all a bit complicated. The King agreed, apparently, to a request from the Duke of Sussex to stay in a royal residence for the last week of his trip to London, mindful that his youngest son no longer has an official UK residence. That's what's reported. And in the event, however, Harry is thought to have chosen to stay in a hotel during his 3-day visit. Meanwhile, an official scheme to deliver portraits of the King has been extended, and it now includes hospital, Coast Guard centres, job centres, universities, Church of England, churches and other public institutions. Well, let's welcome back to my clashes Lord Daniel Moylan, Conservative member of the House of Lords, and also Norman Baker, former Liberal Democrat minister. Right, Daniel, what do you think then? Have you been following this royal story with Prince Harry coming to the UK and not seeing his father?
No. To be perfectly honest, I don't find the whole Prince Harry thing terribly interesting. And let's put this in an historical perspective. This is mild stuff. I mean, George III in the 18th century famously got on extremely badly with all his sons, who were absolutely brutal to him and completely horrible during his long reign. And Edward III not only deposed his father, he was almost certainly party to the plot to murder him later. So, you know, just not turning up while the King's at a garden party and so on. This is all very mild stuff. It's not very interesting in the historical perspective. Fathers and sons argue, that includes kings. He hasn't actually set about to achieve any of his historical precedents. He's just sort of going to live in California, which is relatively mild compared to what has happened in the past.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News with Dubes & Co from 6, followed by Farage at 7. At 8, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg addresses the state of the nation. And at 9, join Patrick Christie's Tonight, followed by Headliners at 11. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 2:46. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now, as we've been reporting, Ebrahim Raisi, Iran's president, and his foreign minister have been killed in a catastrophic helicopter crash.
Yes, harsh weather conditions made it difficult for search teams to find the wreckage, but it was eventually located in the East Azerbaijan province of Iran.
Yes, there has been no evidence so far of foul play, and Iran's supreme leader has declared 5 days of national mourning. An election for a new president is due to take place in the next 50 days.
Well, joining us now for this is the spokesman for the People's Mujahideen Organisation of Iran, an opposition group, is Shaheen Gabaldi. Shaheen, thank you so much for making the time for us today. Firstly, what's the reaction of people within Iran to this news?
Good afternoon. Well, understanding that Ebrahim Raisi was known in Iran as the butcher of Iran because of his direct role in massacring 30,000 political prisoners back in 1988 when he was deputy prosecutor of Iran. 90% of the victims were members and activists of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran who were incarcerated and serving terms in Iranian prison already. So there was a tremendous loath and hatred for Raisi, as I said, whose nickname was Butcher of Tehran. And when he was head of the judiciary in Iran back in 2019, also played a very active role in suppressing the people's protests and killing 1,500 other protesters. So in that light, the mood in Iran is joy and happiness. Obviously, on the other hand, for the regime, and particularly for Ali Khamenei, the regime's supreme leader, the mood is devastation, because one has to bear in mind that this was a strategic and monumental, irreparable blow to Khamenei and the regime in its entirety. So you have two poles in Iran. People are very happy, jubilant, and obviously Khamenei and his retinue are very, very devastated about what happened.
And Shaheen, do you believe this to be an accident? There are no reports so far of any foul play. Do you believe that to be true as well, an accident?
Well, so far all the facts point to that direction. But I think what's more important, as I said, is what does it mean for Iran today and what does it mean for the future of Iran and its consequences. I think, to be honest with you, this is the bigger issue and this is the bigger question.
And these consequences, first of all, the matter of succession. The current Ayatollah is 85 years old. People are obviously thinking about who is next in line for that supreme leader job. And now the person who was presumed to take on that role is dead.
Well, that's one issue, but I think the regime is facing more pressing issues. The clerical regime, or the ruling theocracy, has been facing massive uprisings in Iran for the past 6-7 years. I mean, to be exact, 4 major nationwide uprisings involving people from all walks of life and all social strata in big cities and small cities have stood up against the regime, calling for regime change, overthrowing the regime and establishing a democratic secular republic. So actually, the reason Khamenei installed and handpicked Ebrahim Raisi as the president was this: that in 2018 and 2019, there were massive uprisings in Iran. Khamenei propped up Raisi as a part of his strategy to stop this way, basically sending a message that the killer now is at the helm. And purges were happening in the Iranian parliament, in basically all rank and file, to make the regime as unipolar as possible to stand up against the Iranian people and their mood. And now, with Raisi gone, what does that mean? That means that Khamenei's strategy is basically squashed. He has to start from all over again. And this comes at a time that the regime is facing all sorts of crises from within and internationally. So basically, the regime would be very much more or less ruptured from within, and that would make it much weaker. So as a result, Khamenei has 2 options. One is to open up, make concessions to the people, which obviously will only expedite its overthrow and will encourage people to be even more steadfast in their desire to overthrow the regime, or to rely more on repression at home and belligerence and warmongering in the region, as we have seen in the past few months, and also to drive to acquire nuclear weapons. And most likely Khamenei will choose the latter. So in that sense, as I said, the regime will come out much weaker, but at the same time, much more belligerent and much more repressive to prevent its downfall.
And that is the big risk. When a regime becomes unstabilised, and we've seen these sorts of protests, I think 3 national protests, as you say, now, with increasingly harsh crackdowns, inflation into 40, 50%, really, really high inflation, standard of living going down, not up, helicopters that can't fly in bad weather. When you get all of this put together, you get more erratic regimes that are perhaps less predictable. And we've seen what's going on with the Houthis, what's going on with Hezbollah, how this spills out into wider instability in the region, affecting all of us. Is the risk now that with this instability at the top of Iran, that there'll be wider regional, perhaps even global instability?
Well, I think the clerical regime from its inception has survived on 2 pillars. One is repression at home. Over the past 40+ years, it has executed more than 120,000 activists. Think for a moment, 120,000 activists for democracy and human rights, as I said, overwhelming majority of them from the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. And yet people are still coming in big numbers and bigger numbers for protests from all walks of life and all age groups. And also for regional, as you said, creating havoc and warmongering and belligerence. And as the regime has got weaker inside the country, it has relied more on the other leg, so to speak. So to that effect, in order to deal with this regime, the West needs to adopt a very decisive policy. A policy that is not based on appeasement, which has been the case for the past 4 decades, rather on decisiveness. What does that mean? To stand up on the side of the Iranian people, the desire for regime change, for freedom and democracy, and to take concrete steps. Now, these steps basically means, first of all, to proscribe the Revolutionary Guards, the main entity for repression and terrorism inside Iran and outside of Iran, as a terrorist entity. Impose much tougher sanctions on the regime, and also recognize the rights of the Iranian people and resistance units.
Shaheen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've run to the end of the hour, but thank you so much for putting across your case. Really appreciate it. Well, this has been us here on Good Afternoon Britain. Tom and Emily, don't go anywhere. It's Martin Daubney up next. We're back at 12 tomorrow.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. For many, staying fine through the rest of today, but there are 1 or 2 showers breaking out and a few thunderstorms across Northern Ireland. We're surrounded by weather systems and we're kind of in a weather no man's land, which means the winds are light, which means the cloud isn't shifting too much over parts of southern Scotland, northern England, and the showers are fairly slow moving over the west of Northern Ireland. Some rumbles of thunder here, could drop a lot of rain in a short space of time. There is a Met Office warning in place. For many, it'll be a dry evening and night, though, and then later in the night, we'll see some wet weather returning to parts of central and eastern England. Staying generally pretty mild, double digits, but a bit colder across parts of Scotland, inland here with some clearer spells well down into single figures. Won't stay clear, though. On the east coast, we're going to see the Har returning, I suspect, particularly to the coast of Aberdeenshire and up across the Northern Isles. So another murky day on Tuesday, but inland, plenty of sunshine, at least to start the day, and that'll soon lift the temperatures. Quite cloudy for Northern Ireland, and here again, during the course of tomorrow, the likelihood of some heavy thundery showers breaking out. Bit of a dull, damp start over the North Midlands, parts of northeast England, some showery rain here. Again, 1 or 2 heavier bursts possible. That will tend to drift its way up towards the Manchester area and towards North Wales also. And then later in the day, we'll look at more outbreaks of showery rain coming into East Anglia and the southeast. Possibility of 1 or 2 thunderstorms in southwest England during Tuesday afternoon. And again, that risk of thunderstorms for Northern Ireland. And again, we have another Met Office yellow warning in place. Much of western Scotland stays dry and fine. Temperatures generally a little bit lower tomorrow because there will be more cloud around, especially over the Midlands. So you will notice that dip in temperatures after a warmish day today. On to Tuesday evening, we'll start to see a bit more rain coming into the east, and that's a feature of the weather through the rest of the week. Some heavy rain likely over parts of central and eastern Britain on Wednesday and Thursday.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
It's the biggest cash prize we've given away to date. An incredible £20,000 that you could use however you like. And because it's totally tax-free, every single penny will be in your bank account to do whatever you like with. £20,000 in tax-free cash really could be yours this summer. Hurry, you've got to be in it to win it. For another chance to win £20,000 in tax-free cash, text PRIZE to 63232. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB05, PO Box 8690, Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 31st of May. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people. To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's